Hello everyone, welcome back to Frightening Tales. I hope you will get relaxed by listening these unsolved crime stories and getting much better sleep. So let's get started. Story title: The Lazarus File by Matthew McGuff. In 1986, a young nurse named Sherry Rasmussen was murdered in Los Angeles. Police pinned down no suspects, and the case gradually went cold. It took 23 years and revolutionary breakthroughs in forensic science before LAPD detectives could finally assemble the pieces of the puzzle. When they did, they found themselves facing one of the unlikeliest murder suspects in the city's history. It was a burglary gone awry. That's how it looked, at least, to the Los Angeles police detectives who arrived at a gated condo complex in the Van Nuys section of Los Angeles on the evening of February 24, 1986. The body of a 29-year-old nurse and 3-month newlywed, Sherry Rasmussen, had been discovered by her husband, John Ruetten. When Ruetten, an engineer, had come home from work at 5:55 p.m., he'd known instantly that something was wrong. The garage door was open and the silver 2-door BMW he'd bought Rasmussen as an engagement gift was gone. It seemed strange that she would not be home. He knew she had called in sick to work that morning. When Ruetten rushed inside, he found his wife's body in the ransacked living room. Shards from a broken porcelain vase littered the floor. A TV wall unit was partially collapsed. A credenza drawer had been yanked out and its contents, mostly documents, dumped on the floor. Examining the scene, the lead homicide detective, Lyle Meyer, began to piece together what he thought had taken place. Burglars must have entered through the unlocked front door. While one removed electronics from the wall unit, the other went upstairs and was surprised by Rasmussen. Her attire, robe, t-shirt, and panties suggested she had not been expecting visitors. Rasmussen was 6 feet tall and fit, and the ensuing struggle was ferocious. It evidently began in the dining room on the second floor of the townhouse, where shots were fired from a .38 caliber pistol, one of which may have hit Rasmussen. Hearing the shots, the downstairs burglar probably fled, ditching the video components. A blood trail down the stairs and a bloody handprint near the front door suggested Rasmussen had tried to escape or reach the panic button on the alarm panel located there, but her assailant followed. In the living room, Rasmussen had been bitten on her left forearm, perhaps while grappling for the gun, and then struck over the head with the heavy vase, a blow that likely incapacitated her. The assailant had then taken a quilt from across the room, presumably to muffle the gun's report, and fired more shots through it, killing Rasmussen. A housekeeper in the unit next door later said she'd heard a scuffle and a scream, but no gunshots. Imagining the din to be a domestic altercation, she hadn't called the police. In all, Rasmussen had been shot 3 times in the chest, the bullets piercing her heart, lungs, and spine. When it was over, the killer stole the BMW parked in the garage. That most items in the house appeared undisturbed, including Rasmussen's jewelry box, sitting in plain view on her dresser, seemed to Meyer further evidence of a rushed exit. It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning that Lloyd Mahoney, a criminalist from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, arrived to examine the body. It was his second homicide of the night. Mahoney began by checking for trace evidence around the victim's body: hair, fibers, anything unusual, but he found nothing of note. Next, he opened a sexual assault kit and collected a series of swabs and slides. When he noticed the bite mark on Rasmussen's arm, Mahoney selected a 6-inch swab housed in a tube with a red rubber stopper. He removed the stopper and carefully swabbed the impression left by the assailant's teeth. He reinserted the swab into the tube, squeezed the stopper shut, and labeled it with his initials and the coroner's case number. He placed the tube inside a 5x7-inch LA coroner's physical evidence envelope, on which he wrote Sherry Rasmussen's name, a description of the contents, and where he'd obtained them. Then he sealed it, noting the date and time he had done so. The sun was just coming up over the San Fernando Valley when Mahoney completed his work at the crime scene. He drove directly to the coroner's office, where an evidence custodian booked the swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm into evidence at 10:32 a.m. on February 25, 1986. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, Sherry's parents, arrived in Los Angeles from Arizona the day after the murder. Nels immediately sought out Meyer, the homicide detective, who informed him that the police were looking for one or more burglars in connection with the killing. He also told Nels they had ruled out John Ruetten as a suspect. Nels mentioned that his daughter had complained 1 or 2 months earlier about an ex-girlfriend of her husband's who had shown up at Sherry's hospital one day and confronted her. Nels didn't know the ex-girlfriend's name, but he knew she was a Los Angeles police officer. In Nels's mind, she was a prime suspect. Meyer made a note of the ex-girlfriend in the case file but apparently never followed up. The stolen BMW was found abandoned nearby about a week later, but it offered up no further clues. 2 months after the murder, a pair of men attempted a burglary a few blocks from Sherry's condo. When Meyer learned that one of them had brandished a gun, these unidentified burglars became the focus of his homicide investigation. But the suspects remained elusive, and months passed without further leads. In late October, the Los Angeles Times ran a story on the now 8-month-old case, reporting that the Rasmussens were offering a $10,000 reward for any information regarding the suspects in their daughter's murder, whom Meyer described in the article as 2 Latino men between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall. In 1986, the year Rasmussen was killed, Los Angeles recorded 831 murders, a figure nearly triple what it is today. By the end of the year, LAPD homicide detectives had solved 538 of those murders, a clearance rate of 65%. Of them, 463 were cleared by arrest and 75 cleared other, a catch-all designation for cases in which there is sufficient information to support the arrest of a suspect but, for reasons outside police control, no arrest can be made, for instance, when the suspect is dead or cannot be extradited to Los Angeles. LAPD homicide detectives track their clearance rate the way pro athletes track their season stats. It's the number by which their performance is judged, both within the unit and up the chain of command. The clearance rates reported at the end of each calendar year stand in perpetuity, they cannot be corrected through later arrests. If a homicide occurs in late December but an arrest is made in January, credit for the clearance is taken in the year of the arrest, not the year of the murder. One corollary of this quirk is that a division can raise its current year clearance rate by solving old cases as well as fresh ones. In 2009, for instance, the LAPD's Olympic Division recorded 7 new murders, but its detectives were able to solve a total of 15, giving the unit an eye-popping clearance rate of 214%. At midnight on December 31, when the LAPD closed the books on its 1986 homicide statistics, Sherry Rasmussen's murder was indelibly recorded as one of 293 unsolved cases. Few people could have predicted in early 1986 that the science of police work was about to take an epical leap forward. Not since 1901, when Scotland Yard validated fingerprinting for the purpose of criminal identification, had detectives' power to solve crimes been so profoundly transformed. 7 months after Sherry Rasmussen's death, half a world away from Los Angeles, DNA was used in a criminal investigation for the first time. 2 15-year-old girls from neighboring villages outside Leicester, in the English Midlands, had been killed, one of them that summer and one 3 years earlier. Both victims had been raped and strangled, their bodies left beside out-of-the-way footpaths. The inescapable conclusion for both police and terrified residents was that a serial predator was hiding among the local population. As Joseph Wambaugh, the LAPD detective turned crime writer, recounted masterfully in his 1989 book, The Blooding, an unprecedented force of 200 police officers was assembled to hunt for the murderer. Suspicion quickly fell upon a 17-year-old boy who seemed to have an unnatural interest in the second crime scene. When the boy was arrested and interrogated, he offered a rambling half-confession to the more recent murder, alternately describing his acts in great detail and then, moments later, denying he'd done anything wrong. The police were certain that he had killed both girls. But no matter how hard they pushed him, the boy refused to confess to the first murder. By that time, police laboratories in England and America were accustomed to analyzing biological evidence, typically blood or semen, using a laboratory method called serology to determine blood type. It was useful for investigative purposes, but too imprecise to serve as a smoking gun. Serological testing that the police had expected would link the boy to the victims had come up negative, but, in light of the other evidence, they discounted the results. Someone mentioned to investigators a newspaper article about a local geneticist named Alec Jeffreys, who had developed a novel process for mapping gene variations using DNA molecules. Jeffreys, who would later be knighted for his contributions to forensic science, realized almost instantly the potential of the new technology, for which he coined the term genetic fingerprinting. Police asked Jeffreys to develop DNA profiles from the suspect's blood sample and from semen at the two crime scenes. The results stunned everyone. The same person had indeed raped and killed both girls. But he wasn't the boy whom police had in custody. The first criminal suspect ever subjected to forensic DNA testing was thus exonerated by it. The investigation went back to the drawing board in all respects except one. Police now had a DNA profile of their killer, who they suspected lived nearby. In January 1987, a bold plan was announced. The police requested that all male residents between the ages of 17 and 34 provide blood samples for DNA analysis, to eliminate themselves as suspects. No one was forced to participate in the blooding, as the DNA dragnet came to be called, and few expected that the killer would volunteer himself. But police hoped that the list of those who declined to participate would provide new leads. Several months and thousands of blood samples later, the police received a curious tip. A woman who worked at a bakery in Leicester had been gossiping with co-workers at a pub when one mentioned that he had agreed to take the blood test on someone else's behalf. The woman called the police, and the naive who'd taken the surrogate blood test promptly fingered the man who had talked him into it, a fellow baker with the improbable name of Colin Pitchfork. When confronted, Pitchfork confessed to the killings, and DNA analysis later confirmed that he had raped both girls. In January 1988, Pitchfork became the first murderer in history to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. All over the world, newspapers hailed the breakthrough and marveled at the ways DNA forensics might revolutionize detective work. In Los Angeles, the first two defendants told by prosecutors that DNA evidence would be used against them promptly pleaded guilty. The third, in 1989, was an accused rapist named Henry Wilds. The prosecutor in his case was Lisa Kahn, a deputy in the district attorney's Van Nuys office, the same branch that would have handled the Rasmussen murder a few years earlier, had a suspect ever been arrested. Wilds was charged with committing two rapes, in 1986 and 1987. The LAPD had collected semen at both crime scenes, and Kahn received permission to submit the evidence to a private lab for DNA analysis, which confirmed that Wilds's DNA profile matched that of the rapist. Jury selection began in January 1990. Kahn recalls her desire to find jurors who would be able to make sense of this new universe of DNA testimony. "We were looking for a bright jury," she explains. "So I get up there first and I say, 'Has anybody ever heard of DNA?' Some little retired guy raises his hand and says, 'Yeah, I know. It means does not apply.' DNA experts testified for both sides. The jury, which included Kahn's little retired guy, voted to convict. In the wake of the successful prosecution, Kahn became responsible for handling any DNA admissibility hearing that took place in Los Angeles County. Forensic scientists and legal historians refer to the late 1980s and early 90s as the height of the DNA wars. As DNA evidence was accepted state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, defense attorneys were initially helpless against the highly credentialed scientific experts called by prosecutors to testify. But that began to change in 1989, when two lawyers, Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck, convinced a New York judge that poor laboratory procedures warranted exclusion of DNA evidence that had been introduced against their client. The decision, People v. Castro, sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. Over the next few years, in courtrooms across America, the adversarial process worked its magic. All concerned prosecutors, defense lawyers, forensic scientists, judges had to raise their game. Laboratories became more careful with evidence, trial courts grew more familiar with DNA, and higher courts affirmed its admissibility as a matter of law. By 1994, the DNA wars were basically over, as a singular case would affirm. On June 13 of that year, LAPD homicide detectives visited the Rockingham Avenue mansion of O.J. Simpson to notify him that his ex-wife and an acquaintance of hers had been stabbed to death outside her Brentwood condominium. Simpson was soon linked to the crime by forensic evidence, in particular, a blood-soaked glove that a detective named Mark Foreman reported finding on Simpson's property. Defense lawyers would later suggest that Foreman had planted it. On behalf of the prosecution, Conn coordinated the DNA testing of more than 50 blood samples that seemed to tie Simpson inextricably to the killings. Yet contrary to expectations, Simpson's dream team of defense lawyers did not fight to keep DNA results out, nor did they challenge the forensic value of DNA evidence during the trial. Ultimately, the not guilty verdict turned more on Foreman's alleged racism and the LAPD's carelessness in handling evidence than on the validity of the DNA. Indeed, by the end of the trial, the DNA results had ironically become a pillar of the defense's alternate narrative of the murder. Of course it was O.J.'s DNA, it had been planted at the scene. By one count, the term DNA was spoken in court 10,000 times during the 9-month trial, in addition to innumerable citations on television and in print. Just 5 years after a potential juror had confidently informed Lisa Conn that DNA stood for does not apply, it had become a household term. Detective Stearns, and you think you thought you said you thought his wife was a nurse. Do you have any idea where she was working at the time, or did he ever mention that to you? Was it a hospital or a doctor's office? Stephanie Lazarus, I'm sure he must have mentioned it. I mean, now that you're bringing it up, I think she worked at a hospital somewhere. And, yeah, I may have met her at a hospital. I may have talked to her once or twice. Detective Stearns, at a hospital? Stephanie Lazarus, or more, you know? Even as forensic technology was taking great leaps forward, the investigation into Sherry Rasmussen's murder remained stalled. For years, her parents, Nels and Loretta, did everything possible to keep the case alive. In November 1987, they returned to Los Angeles and held a press conference, at which they renewed their offer of a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Sherry's widower, John Ruetten, was also there. It's been nearly 2 years of hell, not knowing who did this to Sherry or why, he told the assembled reporters. In 1988, Nels wrote a letter to then Chief of Police Daryl Gates requesting his intervention in the case, specifically looking into the possibility that an ex-girlfriend of Ruetten's who was a police officer might have been involved. He received no reply. About that time, Nels again mentioned the ex-girlfriend to the Van Nuys detectives. You watch too much television, he remembers being told. Into the early 1990s, Loretta called the Van Nuys homicide unit regularly to inquire about Sherry's case. In 1993, the Rasmussens traveled to Van Nuys for a face-to-face meeting with one of the detectives who had inherited the case when Lyle Meyer retired. Mayer's successor explained that he had reviewed the original case notes and tried to advance the investigation, but he had been unable to identify any suspects, and prospects for new leads were poor. Nels brought up an article about DNA forensics he had read in a science magazine and offered to pay for DNA analysis of the evidence at a private lab. The detective turned him down. Move on with your lives, he advised the Rasmussens. After that meeting, Loretta stopping calling. Meanwhile, in a freezer in the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, alongside biological evidence from hundreds of other murders. The swab of the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm lay waiting for forensic science and the LAPD's scrutiny to catch up with it. Detective Jaramillo, do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death? Stephanie Lazarus, geez, let me think back. Geez, I don't know if it was if it was burglary or something. Yeah, it's been so many years. Detective Jaramillo, do you remember her first name? Stephanie Lazarus, Sherry. I don't know. Something. If Lisa Kahn was the district attorney's resident DNA geek, that role in the LAPD was filled by Detective David Lampkin. In 1981, as a young cop, Lampkin had requested assignment to the Automated Information Division, which, among other responsibilities, maintained a citywide crime database that could be searched by modus operandi or other basic criteria, for instance, all liquor store robberies in which the suspect wore a mask. Primitive as the IBM punch card and mainframe computer databases might seem today, they were cutting edge at the time, and they nurtured Lampkin's interest in how technology could be used to solve cases. He made detective quickly and requested assignment to a sex crimes unit. Lampkin excelled at the work, but by 1990, he felt burned out and decided to shift to homicides. At the dawn of the DNA age, Lampkin's background investigating sex crimes proved an excellent foundation for homicide work. Given the number of drive-by shootings then occurring in the city, LAPD detectives were far more accustomed to picking shell casings up off the street than searching for hair strands, semen stains, and other barely visible bodily traces. Lampkin, by comparison, had been working with biological evidence for years, and was already convinced of DNA's potential. Moreover, he believed strongly that the LAPD had a moral obligation to do its best to solve cold cases. For these families, this stuff never goes away, he says. In 1993, Lampkin was working homicide at the Hollywood Division, where he had a front row seat for the conclusion of perhaps the coldest case ever solved by the LAPD. The victim, Thora Rose, had been brutally killed in her apartment in October 1963. At the time, detectives had collected more than 30 fingerprint lifts from the scene, but they had never identified a suspect. In 1990, when the lifts were uploaded to a fingerprint database, the computer reported a match with a previously unknown suspect named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson had been an 18-year-old Navy recruit stationed in San Diego. After leaving the Navy in 1966, he fell into drugs and crime, and was eventually sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin for assault and robbery. Robinson emerged from prison a changed man. He got sober and enrolled in college. Later, he married and raised a family. When he was arrested for killing Thora Rose, Robinson was a 45-year-old manager for a building maintenance company in Minneapolis. The LAPD detective who arrested him had been 8 years old when the murder occurred. In court, Robinson cut a respectable figure. His children and members of his church packed the gallery in support of him. Deputy D.A. Paul Turley, in his closing argument, addressed head-on the defendant's evident rehabilitation and the 3 decades that had passed between the crime and the trial. I'm very happy to stand in opposition to the principle that you are entitled to one free murder every 30 years, Turley told the jury. The jurors, and the judge, agreed. Robinson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Rose case made Lampkin eager to see how many other homicides from the city's past might be solved using new technology. LAPD homicide detectives had always been free to work cold cases, but only as time permitted between fresh murders, which wasn't very often. Now, using the new fingerprint and ballistics databases that had come online, Lampkin found he was able to clear some old homicides fairly easily. Although he didn't solve every fresh case he worked, he closed enough old ones to maintain a remarkable 100% personal clearance rate every year from 1991 through 1996. In October 1998, the FBI launched a DNA database called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIs, which gave detectives the ability to compare DNA samples collected at crime scenes with the DNA profiles of legions of potential suspects. When, in 2000, a $50 million state grant became available to fund DNA testing in certain unsolved murders, Lampkin and Lisa Kahn seized the opportunity to propose a joint LAPD/D.A task force to tackle the citywide backlog. After considerable political machinations, the LAPD's new cold case homicide unit went operational in November 2001. The cold case unit initially consisted of 7 detectives, 3 teams of 2, with Lampkin at the helm. The unit was given a 250 square foot former janitorial storage space was so cramped that every time someone wanted to leave, others had to pull in their chairs to make room. The unit gradually came to grips with the magnitude of its caseload. The coldest homicide on the LAPD's books was, literally, the first one, the unsolved murder of a man named Simon Christensen in downtown Los Angeles on the night of September 9, 1899. A century later, the unit could not do much about that one. But how far back could they go, given the inevitable loss and decay of physical evidence? I knew from experience that there was probably nothing left from earlier than 1960, Lampkin says. The unit's initial focus would therefore be on unsolved homicides committed from 1960 through 1998. Using the LAPD's annual statistics, Lampkin tallied the numbers. During those 39 years, 23,713 murders took place in Los Angeles. Of those cases, 13,300 were cleared by arrest and another 2,668 were recorded as cleared other. That left 7,745 cold cases. Page by page, for months, the detectives combed the old homicide summary books. We were looking for cases that had the best chance for us to potentially work with, given the small numbers of detectives we had, says Rick Jackson, who was part of the original unit. So we looked for sexually motivated murders, where there was a better chance for DNA. We looked at maybe a burglary murder that was unsolved. Because a burglary murder, someone is going to have broken into the place, spent some time there. In an indoor crime scene, obviously, the longer you are there, the more you do, whether you're sexually assaulting, burglarizing, moving around, ransacking, you increase the chance for good fingerprints. Late in 2002, when the cold case unit finished its initial screening of all unsolved homicides committed in Los Angeles from 1960 through 1998, it judged 1,400 to have good forensic potential for reinvestigation, among them, the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Stephanie Lazarus, I mean, that's now that you guys are bringing all this stuff up, I mean, that sounds familiar. But, again, I mean, you know, what's this got to do with me dating him and, you know, her getting killed? I mean, I don't, I don't have anything to do with it. Detective Stearns, well, like we said, we just, literally, got this the other day. And then so, you know, I mean obviously, it's, like. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, we recognize the name, and we, you know. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, you work next door to us. And so we're trying to get some background. We're trying to figure this out. In February 2003, a year and a half after its formation, the cold case unit made its first arrest, solving the 1983 murder of a young nurse and mother named Elaine Graham. A suspect, Edmund Marr, had been identified at the time but was never prosecuted. Confronted with wiretap evidence and a DNA report that linked him to the murder, Marr eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 16 years to life. 7 months later, in September, the unit cleared 4 cases at once when it arrested its first serial killer, Adolf Laudenberg. A 77-year-old grandfather with a bushy white beard, Laudenberg was suspected of having raped and strangled 4 women between 1972 and 1975, the media quickly dubbed him the Santa Claus Strangler. The detectives possessed the killer's DNA profile, but had no sample from Loudenberg with which they could compare it. A warrant could have forced their suspect to give them a sample, but they weren't sure they had enough evidence to get one. They could also have asked Loudenberg to submit a sample voluntarily, but that would have alerted him that he was a suspect. Detectives have a third way to get a suspect's DNA sample without running afoul of the Fourth Amendment: collect a voluntarily discarded sample. In this case, it would not be easy. Loudenberg lived in a mobile home that he moved sporadically around Los Angeles. Eventually, a detective arranged to meet at a donut shop to discuss what he described as a series of burglaries from automobiles. Afterward, the coffee cup the old man had used was whisked to the lab and his DNA was harvested from the brim. The profiles matched, and Loudenberg is now serving a life sentence. The press loves these cases, Lampkin says. I mean, it is all positive every time you solve one. If you don't solve one, well, no one solved it. But when you do, you're like a freaking magician. During the summer and fall of 2003, Lampkin's unit was working its way, case by case, through the 1,400 unsolved homicides it had flagged as having good forensic potential. On September 19, DNA analysis was requested on evidence from the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The request reached the desk of a criminalist at the LAPD crime lab, but given staffing shortages, no action was taken on it for more than a year. In December 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Butterworth noticed the unworked request sitting on her colleague's desk and volunteered to handle it. The first article Butterworth analyzed was a blood swatch taken at the victim's autopsy, which gave her Rasmussen's DNA profile. When she turned to the crime scene evidence, the items she initially tested, a piece of fingernail, a blood-stained towel, yielded only the victim's profile. Then Butterworth noticed that the property sheet listed a bite mark swab. Yet she couldn't find the swab in the rape kit or anywhere else. A week went by before the coroner's office could locate the missing evidence. The 5x7-inch envelope, new and crisp when Lloyd Mahoney had sealed it in 1986, was no longer so pristine. Its condition would later be described in court as pretty beaten up and ratty. There was a tear at one end, from which protruded the red cap top of the tube holding the swab, but the tube itself appeared intact. When Butterworth analyzed the swab, it yielded a mixture of two DNA profiles, one of which matched Rasmussen's. The other presumably belonged to her killer. This mystery profile did not return a Cody's hit, which meant the suspect was not in the FBI's DNA database. But a curious detail caught Butterworth's eye. DNA profiles developed since the late 1990s typically include a gender marker. In most violent crimes, the suspect comes up XY, or male. But the DNA results in front of Butterworth were XX, meaning that the person who bit Sherry Rasmussen was female. Without the case file, Butterworth had little information regarding theories of the case or possible suspects, and so lacked context for her discovery. But it was certainly unusual. She typed up her conclusions and sent the report to the Cold Case Unit on February 8, 2005. As it happened, just a few months before, California voters had overwhelmingly approved Proposition 69, a ballot measure co-authored by Lisa Kahn. Prop 69 required police to collect DNA samples from all individuals arrested for a felony or a sex crime, as well as from all state prison inmates who had been convicted of such crimes. The DNA profiles of tens of thousands of California inmates were uploaded to the FBI's vast database. As a result, in 2005 Lampkin's unit was swamped with Cody's-based cold hits, DNA reports implicating suspects previously unknown to detectives. As tantalizing a clue as Butterworth's DNA report provided in the Rasmussen case, namely, that a woman might be the murderer, it did not point directly to a specific suspect, unlike the many cold hits rolling in thanks to Prop 69. Perhaps for this reason, Butterworth's report went into the Rasmussen case file, and the case file itself went back on the shelf, where it would sit for a few years more. Detective Jaramillo, Do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death? Stephanie Lazarus: geez, let me think back. Geez, I don't know if it was if it was burglary or something. Yeah, it's been so many years. Detective Jaramillo: do you remember her first name? Stephanie Lazarus: Sherry. I don't know. Something. If Lisa Kahn was the district attorney's resident DNA geek, that role in the LAPD was filled by Detective David Lampkin. In 1981, as a young cop, Lampkin had requested assignment to the Automated Information Division, which, among other responsibilities, maintained a citywide crime database that could be searched by modus operandi or other basic criteria, for instance, all liquor store robberies in which the suspect wore a mask. Primitive as the IBM punch card and mainframe computer databases might seem today, they were cutting edge at the time, and they nurtured Lampkin's interest in how technology could be used to solve cases. He made detective quickly and requested assignment to a sex crimes unit. Lampkin excelled at the work, but by 1990, he felt burned out and decided to shift to homicides. At the dawn of the DNA age, Lampkin's background investigating sex crimes proved an excellent foundation for homicide work. Given the number of drive-by shootings then occurring in the city, LAPD detectives were far more accustomed to picking shell casings up off the street than searching for hair strands, semen stains, and other barely visible bodily traces. Lampkin, by comparison, had been working with biological evidence for years, and was already convinced of DNA's potential. Moreover, he believed strongly that the LAPD had a moral obligation to do its best to solve cold cases. For these families, this stuff never goes away, he says. In 1993, Lampkin was working homicide at the Hollywood Division, where he had a front row seat for the conclusion of perhaps the coldest case ever solved by the LAPD. The victim, Thora Rose, had been brutally killed in her apartment in October 1963. At the time, detectives had collected more than 30 fingerprint lifts from the scene, but they had never identified a suspect. In 1990, when the lifts were uploaded to a fingerprint database, the computer reported a match with a previously unknown suspect named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson had been an 18-year-old Navy recruit stationed in San Diego. After leaving the Navy in 1966, he fell into drugs and crime, and was eventually sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin for assault and robbery. Robinson emerged from prison a changed man. He got sober and enrolled in college. Later, he married and raised a family. When he was arrested for killing Thora Rose, Robinson was a 45-year-old manager for a building maintenance company in Minneapolis. The LAPD detective who arrested him had been 8 years old when the murder occurred. In court, Robinson cut a respectable figure. His children and members of his church packed the gallery in support of him. Deputy D.A. Paul Turley, in his closing argument, addressed head-on the defendant's evident rehabilitation and the 3 decades that had passed between the crime and the trial. I'm very happy to stand in opposition to the principle that you are entitled to one free murder every 30 years, Turley told the jury. The jurors, and the judge, agreed. Robinson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Rose case made Lampkin eager to see how many other homicides from the city's past might be solved using new technology. LAPD homicide detectives had always been free to work cold cases, but only as time permitted between fresh murders, which wasn't very often. Now, using the new fingerprint and ballistics databases that had come online, Lampkin found he was able to clear some old homicides fairly easily. Although he didn't solve every fresh case he worked, he closed enough old ones to maintain a remarkable 100% personal clearance rate every year from 1991 through 1996. In October 1998, the FBI launched a DNA database called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which gave detectives the ability to compare DNA samples collected at crime scenes with the DNA profiles of legions of potential suspects. When, in 2000, a $50 million state grant became available to fund DNA testing in certain unsolved murders. Lampkin and Lisa Kahn seized the opportunity to propose a joint LAPD/D.A task force to tackle the citywide backlog. After considerable political machinations, the LAPD's new cold case homicide unit went operational in November 2001. The cold case unit initially consisted of 7 detectives, 3 teams of 2, with Lampkin at the helm. The unit was given a 250 square foot former janitorial storage space was so cramped that every time someone wanted to leave, others had to pull in their chairs to make room. The unit gradually came to grips with the magnitude of its caseload. The coldest homicide on the LAPD's books was, literally, the first one, the unsolved murder of a man named Simon Christensen in downtown Los Angeles on the night of September 9, 1899. A century later, the unit could not do much about that one. But how far back could they go, given the inevitable loss and decay of physical evidence? I knew from experience that there was probably nothing left from earlier than 1960, Lampkin says. The unit's initial focus would therefore be on unsolved homicides committed from 1960 through 1998. Using the LAPD's annual statistics, Lampkin tallied the numbers. During those 39 years, 23,713 murders took place in Los Angeles. Of those cases, 13,300 were cleared by arrest and another 2,668 were recorded as cleared other. That left 7,745 cold cases. Page by page, for months, the detectives combed the old homicide summary books. We were looking for cases that had the best chance for us to potentially work with, given the small numbers of detectives we had, says Rick Jackson, who was part of the original unit. So we looked for sexually motivated murders, where there was a better chance for DNA. We looked at maybe a burglary murder that was unsolved. Because a burglary murder, someone is going to have broken into the place, spent some time there. In an indoor crime scene, obviously, the longer you are there, the more you do, whether you're sexually assaulting, burglarizing, moving around, ransacking, you increase the chance for good fingerprints. Late in 2002, when the cold case unit finished its initial screening of all unsolved homicides committed in Los Angeles from 1960 through 1998, it judged 1,400 to have good forensic potential for reinvestigation, among them, the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Stephanie Lazarus, I mean, that's now that you guys are bringing all this stuff up, I mean, that sounds familiar. But, again, I mean, you know, what's this got to do with me dating him and, you know, her getting killed? I mean, I don't, you know, I don't have anything to do with it. Detective Stearns, well, like we said, we just, literally, got this the other day. And then so, you know, I mean obviously, it's, like. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, we recognize the name, and we, you know. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. Detective Stearns, you work next door to us. And so we're trying to get some background. We're trying to figure this out. In February 2003, a year and a half after its formation, the cold case unit made its first arrest, solving the 1983 murder of a young nurse and mother named Elaine Graham. A suspect, Edmund Marr, had been identified at the time but was never prosecuted. Confronted with wiretap evidence and a DNA report that linked him to the murder, Marr eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 16 years to life. 7 months later, in September, the unit cleared 4 cases at once when it arrested its first serial killer, Adolf Laudenberg. A 77-year-old grandfather with a bushy white beard, Laudenberg was suspected of having raped and strangled 4 women between 1972 and 1975, the media quickly dubbed him the Santa Claus Strangler. The detectives possessed the killer's DNA profile, but had no sample from Laudenberg with which they could compare it. A warrant could have forced their suspect to give them a sample, but they weren't sure they had enough evidence to get one. They could also have asked Loudenberg to submit a sample voluntarily, but that would have alerted him that he was a suspect. Detectives have a third way to get a suspect's DNA sample without running afoul of the Fourth Amendment: collect a voluntarily discarded sample. In this case, it would not be easy. Loudenberg lived in a mobile home that he moved sporadically around Los Angeles. Eventually, a detective arranged to meet at a donut shop to discuss what he described as a series of burglaries from automobiles. Afterward, the coffee cup the old man had used was whisked to the lab and his DNA was harvested from the brim. The profiles matched, and Loudenberg is now serving a life sentence. The press loves these cases, Lampkin says. I mean, it is all positive every time you solve one. If you don't solve one, well, no one solved it. But when you do, you're like a freaking magician. During the summer and fall of 2003, Lampkin's unit was working its way, case by case, through the 1,400 unsolved homicides it had flagged as having good forensic potential. On September 19, DNA analysis was requested on evidence from the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The request reached the desk of a criminalist at the LAPD crime lab, but given staffing shortages, no action was taken on it for more than a year. In December 2004, a criminalist named Jennifer Butterworth noticed the unworked request sitting on her colleague's desk and volunteered to handle it. The first article Butterworth analyzed was a blood swatch taken at the victim's autopsy, which gave her Rasmussen's DNA profile. When she turned to the crime scene evidence, the items she initially tested, a piece of fingernail, a blood-stained towel, yielded only the victim's profile. Then Butterworth noticed that the property sheet listed a bite mark swab. Yet she couldn't find the swab in the rape kit or anywhere else. A week went by before the coroner's office could locate the missing evidence. The 5x7-inch envelope, new and crisp when Lloyd Mahoney had sealed it in 1986, was no longer so pristine. Its condition would later be described in court as pretty beaten up and ratty. There was a tear at one end, from which protruded the red cap top of the tube holding the swab, but the tube itself appeared intact. When Butterworth analyzed the swab, it yielded a mixture of two DNA profiles, one of which matched Rasmussen's. The other presumably belonged to her killer. This mystery profile did not return a Cody's hit, which meant the suspect was not in the FBI's DNA database. But a curious detail caught Butterworth's eye. DNA profiles developed since the late 1990s typically include a gender marker. In most violent crimes, the suspect comes up XY, or male. But the DNA results in front of Butterworth were XX, meaning that the person who bit Sherry Rasmussen was female. Without the case file, Butterworth had little information regarding theories of the case or possible suspects, and so lacked context for her discovery. But it was certainly unusual. She typed up her conclusions and sent the report to the Cold Case Unit on February 8, 2005. As it happened, just a few months before, California voters had overwhelmingly approved Proposition 69, a ballot measure co-authored by Lisa Kahn. Prop 69 required police to collect DNA samples from all individuals arrested for a felony or a sex crime, as well as from all state prison inmates who had been convicted of such crimes. The DNA profiles of tens of thousands of California inmates were uploaded to the FBI's vast database. As a result, in 2005 Lampkin's unit was swamped with Cody's-based cold hits, DNA reports implicating suspects previously unknown to detectives. As tantalizing a clue as Butterworth's DNA report provided in the Rasmussen case, namely, that a woman might be the murderer, it did not point directly to a specific suspect, unlike the many cold hits rolling in thanks to Prop 69. Perhaps for this reason, Butterworth's report went into the Rasmussen case file, and the case file itself went back on the shelf, where it would sit for a few years more. Stephanie Lazarus, you know, it's the left, but that's, you know, I think it's just hitting my watch. Unidentified speaker, yeah. You want me to take your watch off? They're going to take it off anyway. Property bag? Stephanie Lazarus, well, just. Detective Stearns, yeah, just put it in here. Go ahead and grab her ring, too. Want to stand up for just a second? Stephanie Lazarus, oh, geez. See if I can get it off. Detective Stearns, okay. Stephanie Lazarus, I'm going to probably have to lick my finger. I need a little spit. Lazarus and the detectives discuss other topics for a while. A torn ACL she suffered playing basketball, medication she needs to take every morning before returning to the ring. Unidentified speaker, they still have your property over there, if you want to take your ring off. Saliva works wonders. Stephanie Lazarus, yeah. From the interrogation room, Lazarus was taken to Linwood, the Los Angeles County Jail facility for female prisoners, where she has been held ever since on $10 million bail. On June 8, 2009, she was charged with the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. Since her arrest, Lazarus has steadfastly maintained her innocence. Through her lawyer, she declined the Atlantic's interview request. Her trial is tentatively scheduled to begin in late August. Next crime. Title: The Girl in the Picture by Niall Capello. For most residents of Holland, Michigan, there was nothing remarkable about March 11, 1989, a Saturday. Frost on the ladders of the city's water towers thawed in the sun. Spring was just over a week away. Mothers poured milk over cereal for kids watching back-to-back episodes of their favorite cartoons. Fathers who worked weekends drove pickup trucks to industrial jobs at local automotive and concrete companies. But all was not well in the house on the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street. It belonged to Dennis and Brenda Bowman, a married couple with 2 children. For the Bowmans, March 11 marked the last time they saw their 14-year-old daughter, Andrea, alive. Dennis was the one who contacted the police. He told them that he'd come home from his job as a wood machinist to find Andrea missing, along with some of her belongings and $100 from his dresser. Dennis described Andrea, whom he and Brenda had adopted when she was an infant, as a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother and had run away to a friend's house once before. Dennis agreed to call around to the homes of kids Andrea knew to find out if anyone had seen her. But his wife soon took over as the family's point of contact. It was Brenda who called the police regularly, and Brenda who corrected the amount of cash missing from her husband's dresser to $150. That was enough for police to issue a warrant for Andrea's arrest for larceny. The warrant listed Dennis as the victim of his daughter's alleged crime. With no foul play suspected, the police labeled Andrea a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. Few people who knew the Bowmans questioned the official narrative. Over the years, there had been whispers about the family. Once, when Andrea was in middle school, she boarded the school bus bleeding from her wrist. Some kids gossiped about a suicide attempt, but others said Andrea had cut herself trying to get back into her house after her parents locked her out. There were rumors that Dennis, a former Navy reservist with reddish-brown hair, a goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses, and Brenda, a portly woman with curled bangs who'd once worked at the jewelry counter at Meyer department store, abused Andrea. But back then, what happened behind closed doors was considered family business. 15 months before Andrea disappeared, Brenda gave birth to a daughter, Vanessa. Andrea went from being an only child to more than a big sister. She was a third parent to the chubby, red-headed baby. While other kids her age went to after-school clubs and Friday night football games, Andrea stayed home changing diapers and cleaning bottles. She kept a photo of her sister in a school folder, where other teens might stash a magazine cutout or a Polaroid of their crush. When she wasn't with Vanessa, Andrea was anxious about the baby's well-being. Many people in Holland assumed that Andrea had gotten so fed up with her home life that she finally split. Maybe she'd gone looking for her birth mother. People heard that she'd hitched a ride at a local truck stop, had left town with an older boy, or was pregnant. Brenda reported a series of tips in the weeks and months following her daughter's disappearance, all of which seemed to confirm that Andrea had run away. At the end of March, Brenda claimed Andrea had been spotted at a 7-11. In mid-April, Brenda said she received an anonymous call from someone claiming that police were looking for the teenager in the right area, but on the wrong street, whatever that meant. In June, she reported a sighting at a local property, where Andrea had supposedly been hanging out with a group of young men. And in October, Brenda said a friend had seen Andrea, pregnant and with dyed hair, in a line at Meyer. Police investigated but found nothing. Andrea's classmates went to prom and graduated, then got jobs or headed to college. Eventually they married and had children of their own. But Andrea remained forever 14. A single photograph formed most people's memory of her. It was given to police when she first vanished. In it, Andrea is sitting against a blue studio backdrop and looking just off camera, with her green eyes cast hopefully upward and pieces of her dark, shaggy hair hanging over her forehead. Her smile is charmingly off-balanced. She looks suspended between adolescence and adulthood. Photos of missing children were often printed on the sides of milk cartons or on flyers taped to the top of pizza delivery boxes. Andrea's picture wound up somewhere else. In 1993, the band Soul Asylum debuted a music video for its song Runaway Train, featuring the images and names of missing kids across America. The video was a huge hit, with several versions airing on MTV and VH1. In the one that played in Michigan, Andrea's photo appears just after the 2-minute mark. Reflecting on the video 20 years after its release, director Tony Kaye claimed that more than 24 missing children were found because of the video. Andrea Bowman wasn't one of them. Back then, what happened behind closed doors was considered family business. Carl Koppelman never expected to solve mysteries. He worked as an accountant until 2009, when his mother's health began to decline. At 46, Koppelman became a full-time caregiver, and his days, once filled with reviews of spreadsheets and financial statements, now revolved around driving to doctor's appointments and administering medications. When he wasn't tending to his mother, Koppelman was online, exploring message boards, news sites, and social media. At the time, the story dominating headlines, and bordering on popular obsession, was the return of J.C. Dugard. In 1991, Dugard had been kidnapped while walking to a bus stop near her home south of Lake Tahoe, California. The blonde, freckled 11-year-old was the subject of a nationwide search, but eventually the case went cold. Then, on August 26, 2009, Dugard reappeared. For 18 years, convicted sex offender Philip Garrido and his wife, Nancy, had held her captive at their home in the town of Antioch, more than 150 miles from where they'd kidnapped her. Dugard had given birth to 2 of Garrido's daughters, who were now 11 and 15. To the embarrassment of local authorities, parole officers had visited the Garrido's home several times during the years Dugard was missing. They'd failed to check the backyard, where the young woman was kept in a network of tents, lean-tos, and sheds. Koppelman's interest in the Dugard case led him to Websleuths, a forum where crime hobbyists and armchair detectives connect and collaborate on unsolved cases. Koppelman gravitated to posts about cold cases, the ones least likely to ever be solved. Until recently, Dugard's had been one of them. How many more would benefit from fresh eyes and a little persistence? Koppelman spent countless hours scrolling through the national database of missing persons and unidentified bodies, known as NAMUS. There's overlap between the 2 main parts of the database, the disappeared and the deceased. The trick is finding it. During late nights at his computer, in a dimly lit corner of his mother's suburban home in El Segundo, California, Koppelman would try to match the characteristics of people who had gone missing with those of the unidentified dead. Finding a likeness could be enough to generate a tip for law enforcement. When Koppelman noticed that the age and condition of some bodies might make it difficult for loved ones to recognize them, it sparked an idea. Koppelman liked to draw portraits for fun, and he was pretty good at it. He also had a CD-ROM of the image editing software CorelDRAW, which someone had given to him as a gift. One day, with his mother napping in the next room, Koppelman installed the program on his computer. It was his first step toward becoming a forensic sketch artist. He started creating lifelike renderings of Jane and John Doe based on photos taken post-mortem. He used CorelDRAW to open eyes, fill in sunken cheeks, and give faces more dynamic expressions. In complicated cases, where bodies had decomposed, he recreated facial structure. The goal was to make the dead more recognizable to loved ones searching for them, and to police trying to identify them. Once he finished a rendering, Koppelman sent it to NAMUS, and the database would sometimes publish it. He also posted his work on websites so other armchair detectives could use it in their identification efforts. Eventually, Koppelman began working with police departments and the DNA Doe Project, which identifies human remains through genetic testing and genealogical research. Glad to help law enforcement generate leads and, in some instances, put a name to a face, Koppelman was almost always an unpaid volunteer. His renderings were instrumental in solving several cold cases, including the identification of the Caledonia Cali Jane Doe, Tammy Jo Alexander, in 2015. But before all that, in 2009, when he was just starting out as an amateur sleuth, Koppelman got interested in the case of the Racine County Jane Doe. When she was found near the edge of a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999, the young woman had only been dead about 12 hours, but rain had washed away any evidence that might have been useful to investigators. It seemed likely that the young woman had been murdered elsewhere and dumped. An autopsy determined that she may have been cognitively disabled, and that she had suffered long-term abuse and neglect. She had broken bones and a cauliflower ear, and her body showed signs of sexual assault. More than 50 people from the farming community where she was found attended her funeral. But no one knew her name or what had happened to her. Her gravestone read "Gone, but not forgotten," a hope more than a description. Koppelman read everything he could find about the Racine County Jane Doe, combing through news articles and social media. He learned that she had hazel green eyes, 2 piercings in each ear, and short reddish-brown hair. She was 5'8" and 120 pounds, and estimated to be between 18 and 30 years old. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt embroidered with red flowers, a design, the manufacturer told police, from the mid-1980s. On NAMUS, Koppelman plugged in some general search criteria: gender, age, location, and clicked through the results for missing persons. With each one, Koppelman asked himself, could this be her? In most cases, the answer was a clear no. The age didn't match, or the location made no sense. But one entry gave Koppelman pause: Andrea Bowman. Andrea and the Racine County Jane Doe shared physical characteristics, and their ages aligned. Andrea would have been 25 in 1999, when the Jane Doe was killed. Holland, where Andrea disappeared, sits directly across Lake Michigan from where the Jane Doe was found. It's just 4 hours by car from one location to the other, tracing the lake's southern shoreline and passing through Chicago. To test the possible identification, Koppelman created a composite image, superimposing Andrea's photo with ones from the Jane Doe's autopsy. He marked the similarities in red. Koppelman took his theory to law enforcement, who found it compelling enough to investigate. To determine whether the Jane Doe was Andrea, police would need to compare DNA from the body with that of someone in Andrea's family. Because Andrea was adopted, authorities had to track down her birth mother. Koppelman knew that could take a while, or that it might never happen, forcing investigators to find other avenues for identification. As the police did their part, Koppelman kept poking around online, learning what he could about Andrea. One day at the end of 2012, he came across a Classmates.com page for Andrea, the premium kind you have to pay to keep active, in order to connect directly with former school acquaintances. Was this Andrea, alive and well, and trying to find old friends? And if it wasn't her, who was it? No one knew her name or what had happened to her. Her gravestone read "Gone, but not forgotten, a hope more than a description." Kathy Turkanian's life story seems ripped from the plot of a made-for-TV movie. Her mother, Shirley, had 6 children with 3 men. Turkanian's stepfather was in the Navy, and the family moved 7 times before she started the 7th grade. The stepfather was deployed for long stretches, and Turkanian's mother was overwhelmed by the demands of taking care of so many kids, including one who had epilepsy. With no one looking after her, Turkanian was molested at the age of 10 by the husband of one of her mother's friends, then raped at 12 by a teenager. She knew she had to escape her existence, so she started to make a plan. In 1972, Turkanian left Virginia, where her family was living at the time, with no clothes except what she was wearing and without saying goodbye. She was 14 and had no money. She hitchhiked to Tennessee, where she met up with a friend in Memphis, and then went to the city's Greyhound bus station. She didn't have a destination in mind, but noticed another traveler wearing colorful beads who mentioned a party down in New Orleans called Mardi Gras. The next day, Turkanian arrived in the Big Easy, where jazz music reverberated through the French Quarter and people laughed and sang jubilantly in the streets. In the midst of the counterculture movement of the 1970s, Turkanian wasn't the only runaway teen in New Orleans. She met a network of young people who helped each other out, offering a place to crash, a job, and tips and tricks for staying off the street. Through this group she met Randy Badger, a 19-year-old who'd recently hitchhiked to Louisiana from Los Angeles. Before long they found a place to stay and were doing everything together. They even got joint work at a circus sideshow. For the first time, Turkanian was living her life how she wanted to. In December 1972, Turkanian and Badger traveled to South Carolina, where it was legal for a minor to get married if they had parental permission. Turkanian's parents gave it gladly. In fact, they insisted on the union. Shirley didn't want to be the person police called if her daughter was in trouble. Turkanian's stepfather signed the necessary paperwork. The couple were married less than a year when Turkanian found out she was pregnant. It was unexpected news, but also another step toward independence. Turkanian wanted to do better by her baby than her mother had done by her. On June 23, 1974, Turkanian gave birth to a healthy daughter. She named her Alexis, after the actress Alexis Smith. Her relationship with Badger soon went downhill. While Turkanian balanced work with caring for Alexis, her husband seemed more interested in partying with friends, including other women. The final straw came when Alexis was 5 months old. Turkanian returned home from a shift to find Badger kissing another woman on the couch, while Alexis was alone in the back room, crying, without a diaper on. Turkanian decided to leave, but she had to think about Alexis, too. What would be best for her daughter? Turkanian resigned herself to what she considered her only option. She went home to Virginia. During the 5-day Greyhound ride, Alexis barely cried. Passengers complimented Turkanian, welcome encouragement for the now single teen mom. But whatever confidence Turkanian felt vanished when she arrived in Norfolk and her mother picked her up at the station. Shirley didn't throw her arms around her daughter or plant kisses on Alexis's plump cheeks. Instead, she looked the pair up and down and puckered her face in judgment. It turned out that Shirley had been diagnosed with breast cancer and given just 5 years to live. Turkanian quickly realized that her mother expected her to care for her siblings. And while Shirley never said it outright, it was clear she didn't think Turkanian should have a child of her own. One day, casually, Shirley said, "You ran out of formula. How are you gonna take care of this kid?" A seed was planted, and from it Turkanian's doubt grew. She increasingly felt like she couldn't give Alexis the life her daughter deserved. Turkanian agreed to give her baby up for adoption. Shirley handled the logistics, assuring Turkanian that Alexis would be taken in by a good family through Catholic charities. Shortly after the adoption was finalized, Turkanian left home again. This time, the teenager hoped, things would be different. You ran out of formula. How are you gonna take care of this kid? Turkanian eventually went to nursing school and met her current husband. They never started a family of their own. For more than 30 years, she didn't have any idea what had become of her daughter. Turkanian, with blonde hair and a confident smile, sometimes wondered if Alexis looked like her. She hoped her daughter was happy, and that Alexis's adoptive parents knew how lucky they were. Then, in April 2010, a letter arrived at Turkanian's home in Massachusetts that upended her life. It was from a social worker, who explained that Alexis had disappeared from her adoptive home in Michigan in 1989. Police were investigating a new lead in the case that Alexis might be a Jane Doe found in Wisconsin. A dead girl. Police needed a sample of Turkanian's DNA to know for sure. Turkanian was perplexed by how little information the letter provided. It didn't include Alexis's adoptive name or the city where she'd lived. Nor did it offer contact information for police or any details about Alexis's disappearance when she was 14, the same age Turkanian had been when she ran away from home. Turkanian was willing to share her DNA, but she wanted to know more about what had happened to her daughter. She searched online for information about missing girls in Michigan. It didn't take long to find one from the town of Holland whose birthday and physical description matched Alexis's. When she saw the girl's school photo, Turkanian thought Andrea Bowman could be her daughter. Eventually, Turkanian would learn that, as a baby, Alexis had wound up in the hands of Virginia's Department of Social Services. Someone, possibly Shirley, had reported that Alexis was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and that Turkanian had taken LSD during the pregnancy. Both lies, Turkanian insisted. The life she'd imagined Alexis would have crumbled in her mind. Desperate to know the truth, Turkanian set up a Facebook page about Andrea's disappearance, as well as a classmates.com account in Andrea's name. She was hoping to connect with her daughter's old friends. Instead, she found Carl Koppelman. Turkanian and Koppelman began exchanging messages, which led to a series of long phone conversations. Turkanian also met other online sleuths interested in Andrea's case, including a woman in New Jersey named Sue Kovacs, who helped Turkanian revamp the Find Andrea Facebook page and expand its reach. Everyone waited for the results of Turkanian's DNA test, to see if there was a match with the Racine County Jane Doe. But for the people invested in the case, determining whether Andrea's body had been found was just one piece of the puzzle. If Andrea was indeed dead, how had it happened? If she'd been killed, who was responsible? Turkanian got in touch with a retired Michigan detective familiar with Andrea's case, a man named Pat O'Reilly. His frankness surprised her. "They botched this case from the beginning," Turkanian remembered him saying. O'Reilly didn't respond to an interview request. According to O'Reilly, the person Turkanian needed to be looking at was Andrea's adoptive father, Dennis Bowman. On a sunny morning in May 1980, a 19-year-old woman was riding her bike north of Holland, Michigan, when a motorcyclist forced her off the road. The man told her to get off her bike and walk into the woods. The young woman didn't move. All she needed was a moment to think, to distract him, to do something. The man pulled out a gun, fired a shot past her, and repeated the order. Still she didn't budge. The man fired the gun again, this time at the ground near her feet. He said he would shoot her next. Just then a car drove by and the motorcyclist turned his head at the noise. The young woman took the opportunity to pedal away as fast as she could. The man didn't shoot or give chase, and she was able to flag down someone in a pickup truck who drove her home. Her parents called the police, and the young woman provided a description of the suspect, a white male with tinted glasses and a blue helmet. His motorcycle, she said, had a black top case mounted on the back. By the end of the day, the police had detained a suspect. The young woman took one look at him and confirmed that he was the man who'd tried to attack her. It was Dennis Bowman, who by then was already a husband and father. At the time, Andrea was almost 6 years old. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was referred for psychological counseling, and a judge determined that he would likely pose a danger to women if he went free. Still, Dennis served the minimum sentence. Brenda stood by her husband then, and she did so again in 1998. One day that year, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan, responded to an alarm at the mobile home of 28-year-old Vicki Vanden Brink. She'd reported so many break-ins that the sheriff's department had installed a security system. When the trooper arrived at the scene, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from the back door. The Bowmans had moved to Hamilton, a town nestled between Holland and Dorr, in 1989, shortly after Andrea's disappearance, and Dennis told the officer that he was temporarily staying with Vanden Brink, who was a former co-worker of his. He was let go, but when authorities got in touch with Vanden Brink, who wasn't home when the alarm went off, she said Dennis was lying. Dennis then changed his story, telling law enforcement that he'd entered the trailer to use the bathroom. He'd been there at least once before, he claimed, when his daughter Vanessa wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vanden Brink. Skeptical, the police obtained Dennis's permission to search his property. In the loft of an outbuilding, they found a black duffel bag containing lingerie that was later identified as Vanden Brink's, as well as a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. Dennis pled guilty to one count of breaking and entering. His sentencing memo, written by his attorney, doesn't mention his 1980 conviction or the prior break-ins that Vanden Brink had reported, which police believed Dennis was responsible for. Dennis's lawyer presented letters written on his client's behalf by various people: the counselor who ran Dennis's sex offender group treatment program, the principal of Vanessa's elementary school, Dennis's boss, and a congregant at Christ Memorial Church, who noted that Dennis had taught Sunday school to kindergartners for the past 6 years. The court also received a letter from Brenda, who defended her husband, and from Dennis himself, who wrote of his behavior: "Sometimes we don't realize a problem until it confronts us face to face." Dennis described himself as happily married for 28 years. He said that he had 2 daughters, one 25 and the other 11. He didn't mention that the older one had been missing for more than a decade. Kathy Turkanian learned the details of Dennis Bowman's criminal record after submitting a Freedom of Information Act request. Based on what Detective Pat O'Reilly had told her, it had seemed logical to dig into Bowman's past. Reading for the first time about what Bowman had done to 2 young women, Turkanian felt a terrible certainty. "When I got his FOIA records, I said, 'Oh, this man killed my daughter.'" If Turkanian was right, it would mean that the Racine County Jane Doe wasn't Andrea. That theory made sense only if Andrea were still alive 10 years after she disappeared. In 2013, the long-awaited DNA results confirmed it: Turkanian wasn't related to the Jane Doe. She and Koppelman, along with the other amateur sleuths interested in Andrea's story, had thought they were connecting the dots in a single cold case when all along they'd been looking at 2. Koppelman and Turkanian were equally yet uniquely obsessive in their approach to detective work. He was thorough and precise, while she was impassioned and incendiary. As Koppelman calculated the next steps in their investigation, Turkanian was too angry to keep silent. The way she saw it, Bowman needed to be behind bars. With his criminal record in hand, she began writing Facebook posts accusing Bowman of being responsible for Andrea's disappearance. She also assembled a Rolodex of people who'd known her daughter: Russ Foster, who briefly dated Andrea in high school; Linda Behrens, the mother of a classmate; Eli Ramos, who rode the school bus with Andrea; and a couple named the Shivers, who'd grown up with Dennis and Brenda in Muskegon, Michigan, and whose daughter, Mindy, remembered seeing Andrea in the runaway train video. Turkanian learned about Andrea's difficult home life and her anxiety about caring for her baby sister. In September 2013, Turkanian and Koppelman met in person at the Missing in Michigan conference. Organized by state police, The conference was designed to raise awareness about and hopefully generate leads in cold cases. Family members and friends of missing persons gathered one Sunday at the Eagle Eye Golf Club in East Lansing, their nervous whispers filling a banquet hall overlooking a green. The schedule included panels, support groups, and even DNA collection, so police could look for matches between families and unidentified remains. Turkanian and Koppelman showed up in custom shirts that read "Find Andrea Bowman." The day kicked off with an early morning group therapy session. Turkanian and Koppelman took their seats in a large circle and listened as people introduced themselves. Koppelman scanned the room and was surprised when his eyes landed on familiar faces. He nudged Turkanian, and she looked over. "That's Vanessa," she said, "and that's Brenda." Brenda and Vanessa recognized Turkanian, too. The Bowmans were aware of what Turkanian had been saying about Dennis on Facebook. When it was Brenda's turn to introduce herself, she told the room, "We have a little situation here." Looking at Turkanian, she added, "I can see that you very much resemble Andrea." Brenda tried to keep talking, but Turkanian didn't let her. She'd lain awake so many nights, furious that her daughter's adoptive mother hadn't protected her. "Tell them the truth, Brenda," Turkanian blurted out. "Tell them about your husband." The session descended into a dramatic exchange before finally getting back on track. Afterward, Turkanian hung back as Koppelman approached Brenda, insisting that he only wanted to talk. Though flustered, Brenda seemed eager to explain her side of the story. She insisted that she and Dennis had fully cooperated with police after Andrea's disappearance. She presented a binder full of notes and missing person flyers as proof. She recounted sightings of Andrea. It was clear she still believed that the teenager had run away. According to Koppelman, when he brought up Dennis's criminal record, Brenda replied, "I haven't forgotten what he did. But I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." Koppelman thought her words sounded rehearsed but not disingenuous. Turkanian had been biting her tongue while Brenda and Koppelman spoke, but now she exploded. "Tell us how you abused, starved, and humiliated her, Brenda," she yelled. Vanessa, reacting to the verbal attack on her mother, had to be held back by a male attendee. "You need to be put in a fucking insane asylum," Koppelman remembered Vanessa saying to Turkanian. The Bowmans and Turkanian avoided each other for the rest of the day. Brenda and Vanessa Bowman didn't respond to interview requests. After the conference, Koppelman and Turkanian returned to their respective homes on the east and west coasts, but they'd already decided they needed someone on the ground in Michigan, a private investigator, to keep working Andrea's case closer to where she'd gone missing. Turkanian hired Jeffrey Floor, a former Michigan state trooper who'd helped solve a 1979 gang rape and murder that happened in Holland. Floor soon managed to get his hands on Andrea's police file, which Turkanian and Koppelman had never seen. Oddly, the earliest documents in it weren't from March 1989, when Andrea disappeared. They were dated 4 months earlier. That was when police responded to allegations of abuse in the Bowman home. The report didn't go into detail about what happened, noting only that local authorities had determined the allegations weren't true. But if one thing was consistent in Andrea's case, it was carelessness. Koppelman and Turkanian were sure law enforcement had missed something. They went looking for people who could fill in the blanks. The amateur sleuths had thought they were connecting the dots in a single cold case when all along they'd been looking at two. Jennifer Jones became friends with Andrea in middle school band, where they both played in the wind section. They remained close during their freshman year of high school. One Tuesday afternoon, Andrea came home with Jones, but when it was time to leave, she said she didn't want to go. According to Jones, Andrea said that her father was sexually abusing her. Jones's mother let her stay the night, and the next day took her to the principal's office, where Andrea repeated the accusation to school officials. Jones was sent to class and assured that the adults would handle the situation. Andrea wasn't at school the rest of the day, and Jones assumed that she was in protective custody. Later she learned that Andrea had gone home with her parents. Around the time Andrea confided in Jones and her mother, she also spoke to Arlene Ron, another local mom. Andrea befriended Ron's sons through their church's youth group and had started hanging out at their house. Ron assumed Andrea had a crush on one of the boys. Eventually Andrea told Ron that her father was abusing her. She also said that Brenda knew and didn't care. Ron was hesitant to get involved. She told Andrea to talk to her youth pastor. Then, one evening as Ron pulled into the Bowman's driveway to drop Andrea off, Dennis appeared and told Ron to stay out of his business. "It just made me so uncomfortable," she later said. Ron never reported the incident to authorities. Within a few months, Andrea was gone. There were other red flags. The Shivers, the couple who'd grown up with the Bowmans in Muskegon, knew about Dennis's criminal record and recalled him bragging about sexual conquests as early as high school. They'd always felt uneasy about him, and they kept a watchful eye over their own daughter when he was around. The Shivers ultimately ended their friendship with the Bowmans after Andrea went missing. When their daughter, Mindy, found the Facebook page for Andrea, she said her parents had never been contacted by the police about the case. In fact, it wasn't until Koppelman and Turkanian connected with them on Facebook that the couple spoke to anyone about their suspicions. Facebook turned up another source, one who believed that Dennis Bowman's criminal behavior had persisted between his convictions in 1980 and 1998. At her request, the activist is using a pseudonym to protect the source's privacy. When Melissa found the Find Andrea page, she sent a message to the administrators describing what had happened to her on a bright September afternoon in 1989, when she was 6. As she was walking to a friend's house, she was flagged down by a man in a truck who promised to take her to see some puppies. He told her that her mother said it was okay and pulled Melissa into the cab. As he drove, the man stroked her face. Melissa's stomach churned. "Is that it?" she asked again and again, pointing to each barn and turnoff they passed, hoping that was where the puppies would be. Eventually, the driver pulled into a rural area near the town of Hamilton. The man parked the truck, grabbed Melissa by the neck, and dragged her into a thicket. He ripped off her blue sweater, printed with the words "Young at Heart," and wrapped it around her mouth. He tied her hands behind her back with a length of rope and removed the rest of her clothes. Then, as the attacker knelt over Melissa and unzipped his pants, he startled at the sound of barking dogs nearby. The man ran off, leaving Melissa alone. She walked naked and barefoot to the main road. 2 cars pulled over, and someone called 911. The police visited Melissa's home that night, and a sketch artist created a rendering of the perpetrator and his vehicle, a red pickup truck with a white cab. But a suspect was never found. The case went cold, and the statute of limitations eventually expired. As she got older, what bothered Melissa most was that the man who'd attacked her was still out there and could be hurting other girls. She kept tabs on local news articles, police statements, and social media posts, looking for any stories like hers. But it wasn't until she stumbled upon the Find Andrea Facebook page that Melissa believed she could finally name the man who'd lured her into the truck, Dennis Bowman. Turkanian and Koppelman were now convinced that Dennis Bowman was a serial predator who had killed Andrea and covered it up by claiming that she'd run away. By 2016, Turkanian said, "I was screaming from the tops of Facebook that he had my daughter buried in his backyard." But any evidence remained circumstantial at best. There was no proof Andrea was dead, let alone murdered. And nothing tied Bowman to other unsolved criminal cases, including Melissa's abduction. Between 2013 and 2017, Turkanian and Koppelman met in Michigan 4 times. While there, they occasionally caught up with Chris Haverdink, the detective who'd taken over Andrea's case. Usually, they met him on the patio of Goog's Pub and Grub, a local haunt next to the Days Inn where Melissa worked, and helped Turkanian and Koppelman get discounted rooms. Haverdink agreed that Bowman was suspicious, but that wasn't enough to arrest him. Turkanian and Koppelman visited Michigan for the last time in May 2017. It was becoming clear that they'd gotten as far as they could on their own. A break in the case would almost certainly have to come from law enforcement, a witness, or Bowman himself. Before flying home, Turkanian and Koppelman sat in their rental car outside the Bowman's house in Hamilton. After years of examining Google Street Maps and satellite images, Turkanian had zeroed in on a concrete slab at the back of the property. She was convinced Bowman had buried her daughter underneath it. She stared at the house until the last possible minute, when Koppelman insisted they'd miss their flights if they didn't leave. She was just sitting there with these binoculars, Koppelman said, like she knew that's where Andrea was. Peggy Johnson was never reported missing. She was last seen at a homecoming dance in Harvard, Illinois, in 1994, and most people who knew her assumed she'd run away. An aunt worried enough to take out a classified ad in the paper. But nobody seemed to suspect that something terrible might have happened to the auburn-haired girl. Johnson disappeared shortly after the death of her mother, the sole parent in her low-income household. The 19-year-old found herself orphaned and homeless, with a developmental disability that made it difficult for her to get a job. By chance she met a nurse named Linda LaRoche who offered her work as a live-in housekeeper and nanny to her children. The teenager jumped at the opportunity. Over the next 5 years, LaRoche abused Johnson, beating her, starving her, and forcing her to live in a crawl space. The violence culminated in 1999, when LaRoche allegedly murdered the 23-year-old. When Johnson's body was found dumped in Raymond, Wisconsin, the cause of death was determined to be sepsis resulting from pneumonia. An autopsy also revealed decaying teeth, broken ribs, evidence of sexual assault, and a cauliflower ear deformity. No one could identify her, so she became known by the place where she was found. She was the Racine County Jane Doe. 20 years after Johnson's death, Wisconsin police received a tip from a concerned citizen about a nurse who'd confessed to killing someone who worked for her in the late 1990s. In early November 2019, Racine County authorities announced both Johnson's identity and LaRoche's arrest. LaRoche is still awaiting trial. The revelation was bittersweet for Turkanian. She was glad that the girl she once thought might be her daughter had been identified. But Andrea was still out there. When would Turkanian get answers? 2 weeks later, on a cold Friday morning, Turkanian's phone rang. Melissa's name flashed across the screen. Turkanian answered, and without even saying hello, Melissa announced, "They got him." Earlier that morning, Melissa had received a call from a friend who happened to live on the same block as the Bowmans. The place was swarming with police patrol cars clogged the street, and flashing lights reflected off the windows of surrounding homes. Something was going on. Something big. Turkanian felt dizzy. There was only one thing she could think to do. She hung up and called Koppelman. He was just sitting down at his desk for the day. Koppelman still did forensic sketching and online sleuthing on the side, but he'd returned to full-time work as an accountant after his mother passed away. Koppelman listened as Turkanian described what was happening at the Bowmans. They were sure it was connected to Andrea's disappearance. What else could it be? By that afternoon, the news was out. Bowman had been arrested by the Allegan County Sheriff's Office. But not because of anything to do with Andrea. He'd been arrested in relation to a murder Turkanian and Koppelman had never heard of, one committed 9 years before Andrea disappeared, more than 800 miles away from the shores of Lake Michigan. Turkanian answered the phone, and without even saying hello, Melissa announced, "They got him." Kathleen Doyle was the daughter of a naval officer and the wife of a pilot. At the time of her murder, in 1980, she'd been married just 9 months. Her husband was deployed on the USS Eisenhower in the Indian Ocean, and Doyle and the couple's tabby cat, Ike, were living alone in a small house on Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia. Doyle was an aspiring author who'd recently taken up journaling. The 25-year-old wrote about her anxieties and her excitement for the future. Doyle had been dead for almost 2 days when her body was found. She'd been stripped, gagged, and strangled with electrical cord, then raped and stabbed. Authorities suspected an intruder had done it, a stranger. They collected semen from the scene but had few leads until serial killer Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in 1983. Lucas claimed that he and a partner, Otis Toole, were responsible for hundreds of unsolved murders across the country, including Doyle's. The following year, police charged the pair, but Lucas's confessions were later revealed to be false, and the charges were dropped. In a letter to the editor published by the Virginian Pilot in 2003, John O'Brien, Doyle's father, chastised detectives for their missteps and expressed the steadfast hope that his daughter's killer would be caught. That didn't happen before O'Brien died, in 2016. Eventually, science caught up with the case. Genetic genealogy, which compares unidentified DNA with a huge number of samples stored in databases, was becoming a popular way of investigating cold cases. Authorities didn't expect the method to produce exact matches but rather partial ones, genetic relatives police could use to triangulate and identify potential suspects. Norfolk investigators partnered with Paraben Nano Labs, a leader in the field, to test DNA collected at the scene of Doyle's murder. Soon, based on genealogical research, they had a list of more than 30 suspects. Investigators needed to collect DNA from each person on the list to conduct a direct comparison. But with the suspects spread across several states, and a backlog of other cases on their desks vying for attention, the process could take law enforcement months or even years. Then, in 2019, a group of Norfolk detectives went to a national seminar attended by cold case teams from around the country. It was an opportunity to learn about new technologies, collaborate on strategies, and exchange information. The Norfolk team, which had the list of suspects in the Doyle case in hand, got acquainted with a team from Michigan where, as it happened, one of the people on the list lived. The Michigan detectives were familiar with Dennis Bowman's name. He had a criminal record, and they knew what Kathy Turkanian had accused him of doing. The police also had his DNA on file, and they were willing to share it for comparison. The results confirmed that semen found at the scene of Doyle's murder came from Bowman. Norfolk law enforcement issued a warrant for his arrest. 2 days later, on November 22, 2019, Melissa called Turkanian to report the police raid. Within a few months, Bowman would be extradited to Virginia to stand trial. By then, he'd already confessed. He admitted to entering Doyle's home through a back window. He claimed that he was drunk and that it was an attempted robbery. He said he didn't expect to find Doyle in the house, that he didn't plan to kill her. But she was there and he did. At the time, Bowman was in Norfolk for his annual 2-week service in the Navy Reserve. He was also out of jail on bond. He was awaiting trial for the attempted assault of the 19-year-old Holland woman, the one he fired a gun at before she escaped on her bike. Turkanian learned that she'd inadvertently played a role in solving Doyle's murder. Jeffrey Floor, the private detective, told her that at some point the Bowmans had visited the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to report Turkanian for harassment. They claimed she was making defamatory accusations about Dennis online. Investigators offered Dennis a bottle of water and kept it when he left. According to Floor, that was how his DNA came into their possession. The sheriff's office declined to comment on the investigation. As with the resolution of the Racine County Jane Doe investigation, Turkanian wasn't sure how to feel about the news in the Doyle case. Bowman was behind bars, but Turkanian felt like she was still waiting for her turn, for her daughter's turn at justice. 3 months after Bowman's arrest it came. In the first week of February 2020, with a thick layer of snow blanketing the ground, police returned to the Bowmans' property. Melissa again called Turkanian, who phoned Koppelman. There was a forensics team on site this time, with a crime scene tent and dogs in the backyard. Melissa sent photos. Officials appeared to be concentrating on one area in particular, and they had started to dig. Later that day, the police held a press conference. They announced that human skeletal remains had been found, and that they likely belonged to Andrea Bowman. The police needed to confirm her identity. Turkanian provided her DNA immediately. In March, almost 31 years to the day after Andrea disappeared, the results came back. There was a DNA match. Turkanian had been right, and not just about what happened to her daughter. The police had found Andrea's remains beneath the concrete slab behind the Bowman's house. Dennis claimed that Andrea's death was an accident. He said that they were arguing and he slapped her, causing her to fall and break her neck. He reported her missing to cover it up. That was the story he told Brenda in correspondence from prison. In June 2020, Dennis received 2 life sentences plus 20 years for killing Kathleen Doyle. He was ordered to serve his time in Michigan, where he would stand trial for Andrea's murder. The first hearing was held in February 2021. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the proceedings were live-streamed, and Koppelman and Turkanian watched from their computer screens. Brenda took the stand first. She tearfully recounted how she'd made missing person posters because she believed Andrea had run away. She said she learned the truth only after Dennis was arrested in the Doyle case. When she was asked whether Andrea had ever accused Dennis of molesting her, Brenda said yes, but that she hadn't believed the allegations were true. "That's a lie," she'd told Andrea, "and you know it." It was Brenda who told police where to find Andrea's remains. In a call from prison, Dennis had confessed to burying their daughter in the backyard. Brenda said she didn't believe him at first. They hadn't lived in their house in Hamilton when Andrea died, so how could he have buried her there? To Brenda's horror, Dennis explained that he'd moved their daughter's body to the new property as soon as they signed the papers for it. The cement slab in the yard was the headstone of a grave Brenda never knew was there, in the shadow of the house she and Dennis shared for nearly 30 years. He didn't lie this time, Brenda told a detective when Andrea's remains were found. He didn't lie. As other witnesses took the stand, Dennis sat quietly in a green shirt, bow tie, and face mask. Testimony from experts involved with Andrea's recovery and autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered. Dennis had wrapped her body parts in plastic bags and stuffed them into a cardboard barrel before burying them. The remains were too decomposed to establish an official cause of death, but the circumstances were sufficient for the medical examiner to rule what happened a homicide. Chris Haverdink, the detective Turkanian and Koppelman met with at Goog's Pub and Grub, took the stand. Haverdink said that after being arrested in Michigan in 2019 for Kathleen Doyle's murder, Dennis eventually told authorities that he had nothing left to lose, and went on to describe a version of events similar to the one he'd given Brenda, that Andrea's death had been an accident, and that he'd tried to cover his tracks. He'd dismembered his daughter because she wouldn't fit in the cardboard barrel otherwise. To confirm the story, he pointed authorities to a machete stashed underneath his bed. The details were hard for Turkanian to hear, but she felt comforted knowing that Koppelman, other online detectives, and people like Melissa were just a phone call or a text away. They didn't believe Dennis's story. Like Turkanian, they were sure Dennis had intended to kill Andrea. He'd engaged in a clear pattern of violence against young women. In fact, just a month prior to the hearing, another crime had come to light. He didn't lie this time. He didn't lie. Man sought in assault reads a front-page headline in the Holland Sentinel, published October 18, 1979. The article details a violent attack on a 27-year-old woman who early on a Sunday morning was bound, gagged, and sexually assaulted by an intruder in her home. The perpetrator took cash before fleeing the scene, and was described as a white man between 25 and 30 years old, with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was estimated at 5'6" and 150 pounds. According to the young woman, her assailant was wearing a leather jacket and dark pants. The newspaper published a police sketch of the suspect, his ink-blotted pupils staring blankly from the front page. More than 40 years after the assault, Dennis Bowman confessed to the crime. There was little risk in doing so. He was already behind bars for murder, and the statute of limitations in the case had long since expired. When they read the article about the 1979 crime, Turkanian and Koppelman couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between Bowman and the police sketch. But it was the last line of the article that really caught their attention. According to the lead detective in the case, there had been a recent uptick in reports of prowlers in the neighborhood where the crime had occurred. Police suspected the attacker might have committed other crimes. Could there be other cold cases connected to Bowman? For years, Melissa had insisted hers was. She was frustrated that Bowman would confess to the 1979 assault, but not to what she believed he'd done to her. Now, at least, the police seemed to be listening to her. In February 2021, Michigan's News 8 reported that police had confirmed Bowman was their prime suspect in Melissa's abduction. Rope recovered from the scene and kept on file since 1989, when the crime occurred, had come back negative for Bowman's DNA, but authorities said they were hopeful that technological advancements would allow it to be retested in the future. Turkanian and Koppelman have identified other unsolved crimes they believe Bowman, who is now 72, should be investigated for. In 1977, Deborah Polinsky, a 20-year-old Holland woman, was killed in what one newspaper called a sex slaying. After Polinsky failed to show up for work, a colleague found her stripped, sexually assaulted, and stabbed to death in her home, with her German Shepherd standing guard over the body. In 1970, Shelley Speet Mills, a 19-year-old newlywed, was stabbed to death in her apartment in Grand Rapids, 30 miles northeast of Holland. Mills's mother, who'd driven to the city to take her daughter to lunch, found her body. Around the time of Melissa's abduction, there were a series of similar incidents. A 13-year-old girl was nearly pulled off a Holland street by a stranger. A 9-year-old girl on a bike was stopped by a man who opened his car door and asked repeatedly if she wanted to get ice cream. And several weeks after Melissa was taken, two siblings, aged 9 and 7, were walking near Van Raalte Elementary School when they encountered a man they later estimated to be in his 30s. The suspect, who was driving a truck and wearing blue jeans and a blue winter jacket, offered the children money, then chased them on foot when they refused to get in his vehicle. The siblings later described the truck as shiny and red. Melissa had described her abductor's vehicle similarly: red truck, white cab. A photo of a truck Bowman once drove, provided to Turkanian and Koppelman by Bowman's sister-in-law, matches that description. Bowman's lawyer didn't reply to requests for comment. His client is expected to stand trial again in January 2022. Whether in person or online, Koppelman and Turkanian will be watching the proceedings closely. The friends speak often on the phone and social media. They're vocal evangelists of armchair detective work. The internet is an investigative tool, and used consistently in a certain way, it will get you somewhere, Turkanian said. After Peggy Johnson was identified as the Racine County Jane Doe, police announced that she would be reburied next to her mother under her real name. Turkanian wants the same thing for her daughter. She's planning to go to court to obtain Andrea's remains, so that she can bury her as Alexis Badger. It's a long shot, but then the chances that Dennis Bowman would ever be arrested were slim, and that happened. No one expected that Turkanian and Koppelman's persistence would help resolve numerous cold cases, but it did. Turkanian doesn't believe in closure. It's too pat a concept to apply to tragedy, too neat a way to describe what it means to find answers decades after a young woman vanishes or a body is found without a name. But nothing is impossible, and it's never too late if Turkanian believes in anything. It's that. Next story. Title: Mysterious Circumstances by David Gran. Richard Lancelyn Green, the world's foremost expert on Sherlock Holmes, believed that he had finally solved the case of the missing papers. Over the past 2 decades, he had been looking for a trove of letters, diary entries, and manuscripts written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Holmes. The archive was estimated to be worth nearly $4 million, and was said by some to carry a deadly curse, like the one in the most famous Holmes story, The Hound of the Baskervilles. The papers had disappeared after Conan Doyle died, in 1930, and without them no one had been able to write a definitive biography, a task that Green was determined to complete. Many scholars feared that the archive had been discarded or destroyed. As the London Times noted earlier this year, its whereabouts had become a mystery as tantalizing as any to unfold at 221B Baker Street, the fictional den of Holmes and his fellow sleuth, Dr. Watson. Not long after Green launched his investigation, he discovered that one of Conan Doyle's 5 children, Adrian, had, with the other heirs' agreement, stashed the papers in a locked room of a chateau that he owned in Switzerland. Green then learned that Adrian had spirited some of the papers out of the chateau without his siblings' knowledge, hoping to sell them to collectors. In the midst of this scheme, he died of a heart attack, giving rise to the legend of the curse. After Adrian's death, the papers apparently vanished. And whenever Green tried to probe further, he found himself caught in an impenetrable web of heirs, including a self-styled Russian princess who seemed to have deceived and double-crossed each other in their efforts to control the archive. For years, Green continued to sort through evidence and interview relatives, until one day the muddled trail led to London and the doorstep of Jean Conan Doyle, the youngest of the author's children. Tall and elegant, with silver hair, she was an imposing woman in her late 60s. Something very strong and forceful seems to be at the back of that wee body, her father had written of Jean when she was 5. Her will is tremendous. Whereas her brother Adrian had been kicked out of the British Navy for insubordination, and her elder brother Dennis was a playboy who had sat out the Second World War in America, she had become an officer in the Royal Air Force, and was honored, in 1963, as a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. She invited Green into her flat, where a portrait of her father, with his walrus mustache, hung near the fireplace. Green had almost as great an interest in her father as she did, and she began sharing her memories, as well as family photographs. She asked him to return, and one day, Green later told friends, she showed him some boxes that had been stored in a London solicitor's office. Peering inside them, he said, he had glimpsed part of the archive. Dame Jean informed him that, because of an ongoing family dispute, she couldn't yet allow him to read the papers, but she said that she intended to bequeath nearly all of them to the British Library, so that scholars could finally examine them. After she died, in 1997, Green eagerly awaited their transfer, but nothing happened. Then, last March, Green opened the London Sunday Times and was shocked to read that the lost archive had turned up at Christie's auction house and was to be sold, in May, for millions of dollars by 3 of Conan Doyle's distant relatives. Instead of going to the British Library, the contents would be scattered among private collectors around the world, who might keep them inaccessible to scholars. Green was sure that a mistake had been made, and hurried to Christie's to inspect the materials. Upon his return, he told friends that he was certain that many of the papers were the same as those he had uncovered. What's more, he alleged, they had been stolen and he had proof. Over the next few days, he approached members of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, one of hundreds of fan clubs devoted to the detective. Green had once been chairman. He alerted other so-called Sherlockians, including various American members of the Baker Street Irregulars, an invitation-only group that was founded in 1934 and named after the street urchins Holmes regularly employed to ferret out information. Green also contacted the more orthodox scholars of Conan Doyle, or Doyleans, about the sale. Unlike Green, who moved between the two camps, many Doyleans distanced themselves from the Sherlockians, who often treated Holmes as if he were a real detective and refused to mention Conan Doyle by name. Green shared with these scholars what he knew about the archive's provenance, revealing what he considered the most damning piece of evidence, a copy of Dame Jean's will, which stated, "I give to the British Library all my late father's original papers, personal manuscripts, diaries, engagement books, and writings." Determined to block the auction, the makeshift group of amateur sleuths presented its case to members of Parliament. Toward the end of the month, as the group's campaign intensified and its objections appeared in the press, Green hinted to his sister, Priscilla West, that someone was threatening him. Later, he sent her a cryptic note containing 3 phone numbers and the message, "Please keep these numbers safe." He also called a reporter from the London Times, warning that something might happen to him. On the night of Friday, March 26, he had dinner with a longtime friend, Lawrence Keane, who later said that Green had confided in him that an American was trying to bring him down. After the two men left the restaurant, Green told Keane that they were being followed, and pointed to a car behind them. The same evening, Priscilla West phoned her brother, and got his answering machine. She called repeatedly the next morning, but he still didn't pick up. Alarmed, she went to his house and knocked on the door. There was no response. After several more attempts, she called the police, who came and broke open the entrance. Downstairs, the police found the body of Green lying on his bed, surrounded by Sherlock Holmes books and posters, with a cord wrapped around his neck. He had been garroted. "It will lay out the whole case for you," John Gibson, one of Green's closest friends, told me when I phoned him shortly after learning of Green's death. Gibson had written several books with Green, including My Evening with Sherlock Holmes, a 1981 collection of parodies and pastiches of the detective stories. With a slight stammer, Gibson said of his friend's death, "It's a complete and utter mystery." Not long after, I traveled to Great Bookham, a village 30 miles south of London, where Gibson lives. He was waiting for me when I stepped off the train. He was tall and rail-thin, and everything about him, narrow shoulders, long face, unruly grey hair, seemed to slouch forward, as if he were supported by an invisible cane. "I have a file for you," he said, as we drove off in his car. "As you'll see, there are plenty of clues and not a lot of answers." He sped through town, past a 12th century stone church and a row of cottages, until he stopped at a red brick house surrounded by hedges. "You don't mind dogs, I hope," he said. "I've 2 Cocker Spaniels. I only wanted one, but the person I got them from said that they were inseparable, and so I took them both, and they've been fighting ever since." When he opened the front door, both spaniels leaped on us, then at each other. They trailed us into the living room, which was filled with piles of antique books, some reaching to the ceiling. Among the stacks was a near-complete set of the Strand magazine, in which the Holmes stories were serialized at the turn of the 20th century. A single issue, which used to sell for half a shilling, is now worth as much as $500. Altogether, there must be about 60,000 books, Gibson said. We sat on a couch and he opened his case file, carefully spreading the pages around him. "All right, dogs. Don't disturb us," he said. He looked up at me. "Now I'll tell you the whole story." Gibson said that he had attended the coroner's inquest and taken careful notes, and as he spoke he picked up a magnifying glass beside him and peered through it at several crumpled pieces of paper. "I write everything on scraps," he said. The police, he said, had found only a few unusual things at the scene. There was the cord around Green's neck, a black shoelace. There was a wooden spoon near his hand, and several stuffed animals on the bed. And there was a partially empty bottle of gin. The police found no sign of forced entry and assumed that Green had committed suicide. Yet there was no note, and Sir Colin Barry, the president of the British Academy of Forensic Sciences, testified to the coroner that, in his 30-year career, he had seen only one suicide by garroting. "One," Gibson repeated. "Self-garroting is extremely difficult to do," he explained. "People who attempt it typically pass out before they are asphyxiated. Moreover, in this instance, the cord was not a thick rope but a shoelace, making the feat even more unlikely." Gibson reached in his file and handed me a sheet of paper with numbers on it. "Take a look," he said. "My phone records." The records showed that he and Green had spoken repeatedly during the week before his death. If the police had bothered to obtain Green's records, Gibson went on, they would no doubt show that Green had called him only hours before he died. "I was probably the last person to speak to him," he said. The police, however, had never questioned him. During one of their last conversations about the auction, Gibson recalled, Green had said he was afraid of something. "You've got nothing to worry about," Gibson told him. "No, I'm worried," Green said. "What?" "You fear for your life." "I do." Gibson said that, at the time, he didn't take the threat seriously but advised Green not to answer his door unless he was sure who it was. Gibson glanced at his notes. "There was something else," he said, "something critical. On the eve of his death, he reminded me, Green had spoken to his friend Keane about an American who was trying to ruin him. The following day, Gibson said, he had called Green's house and heard a strange greeting on the answering machine. Instead of getting Richard's voice in the sort of Oxford accent, which had been on the machine for a decade, Gibson recalled, I got an American voice that said, "Sorry, not available." I said, "What the hell is going on?" I thought I must have dialed the wrong number. So I dialed really slowly again. I got the American voice. I said, "Christ Almighty." Gibson said that Green's sister had heard the same recorded greeting, which is one reason that she had rushed to his house. Reaching into his file, Gibson handed me several more documents. "Make sure you keep them in chronological order," he said. There was a copy of Jean Conan Doyle's will, several newspaper clippings on the auction, an obituary, and a Christie's catalog. That was pretty much all he had. The police, Gibson said, had not conducted any forensic tests or looked for fingerprints. And the coroner, who had once attended a meeting of the Sherlock Holmes Society to conduct a mock inquest of the murder from a Conan Doyle story in which a corpse is discovered in a locked room, found himself stymied. Gibson said that the coroner had noted that there was not enough evidence to ascertain what had happened, and, as a result, the official verdict regarding whether Green had killed himself or been murdered was left open. Within hours of Green's death, Sherlock Ian seized upon the mystery, as if it were another case in the canon. In a web chat room, one person, who called himself Inspector, wrote, "As for self-garroting, it is like trying to choke oneself to death by your own hands." Others invoked the curse, as if only the supernatural could explain it. Gibson handed me an article from a British tabloid that was headlined "Curse of Conan Doyle Strikes Holmes Expert." "So what do you think?" Gibson asked. "I'm not sure," I said. Later, we went through the evidence again. I asked Gibson if he knew whose phone numbers were on the note that Green had sent to his sister. Gibson shook his head. "It hadn't come up at the inquest," he said. "What about the American voice on the answering machine?" I asked. "Do we know who that is?" "Unfortunately, not a clue. To me, that's the strangest and most telling piece of evidence. Did Richard put that on his machine? What was he trying to tell us? Did the murderer put it on there? And, if so, why would he do that?" I asked if Green had ever displayed any irrational behavior. "No, never," he said. "He was the most level-headed man I ever met." He noted that Priscilla West had testified at the inquest that her brother had no history of depression. Indeed, Green's physician wrote to the court to say that he had not treated Green for any illnesses for a decade. "One last question," I said. "Was anything taken out of the apartment?" "Not that we know of. Richard had a valuable collection of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle books, and nothing appears to be missing." As Gibson drove me back to the train station, he said, "Please, you must stay on the case. The police seem to have let poor Richard down." Then he advised, as Sherlock Holmes says, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Some facts about Richard Green are easy to discern, those which illuminate the circumstances of his life, rather than the circumstances of his death. He was born on July 10, 1953, he was the youngest of 3 children. His father was Roger Lancelyn Green, a best-selling children's author who popularized the Homeric myths and the legend of King Arthur, and who was a close friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and Richard was raised near Liverpool, on land that had been given to his ancestors in 1093, and where his family had resided ever since. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was the American consul in Liverpool in the 1850s, visited the house one summer, and he later described it in his English notebooks. We passed through a considerable extent of private road, and finally drove through a lawn, shaded with trees, and closely shaven, and reached the door of Poulton Hall. Part of the mansion is 300 or 400 years old. There is a curious, old, stately staircase, with a twisted balustrade, much like that of the old Province House in Boston. The drawing room looks like a very handsome modern room, being beautifully painted, gilded, and paper-hung, with a white marble fireplace, and rich furniture, so that the impression is that of newness, not of age. By the time Richard was born, however, the Green family was, as one relative told me, very English, a big house and no money. The curtains were thin, the carpets were threadbare, and a cold draught often swirled through the corridors. Green, who had a pale, pudgy face, was blind in one eye from a childhood accident, and wore spectacles with tinted lenses. One friend told me that, even as an adult, Green resembled the god of Pan, with cherubic-like features, a mouth which curved in a smile which was sympathetic, ironic, and always seeming to suggest that there was just one little thing that he was not telling you. Intensely shy, with a ferociously logical mind and a precise memory, he would spend hours roaming through his father's enormous library, reading dusty first editions of children's books. And by the time he was 11 he had fallen under the spell of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was not the first great literary detective. That honor belongs to Edgar Allan Poe's Inspector Auguste Dupin, but Conan Doyle's hero was the most vivid exemplar of the fledgling genre, which Poe dubbed tales of ratiocination. Holmes is a cold, calculating machine, a man who is, as one critic put it, a tracker, a hunter down, a combination of bloodhound, pointer, and bulldog. The gaunt Holmes has no wife or children, as he explains, "I am a brain, Watson. The rest of me is a mere appendix." Rigidly scientific, he offers no spiritual bromides to his bereaved clients. Conan Doyle reveals virtually nothing about his character's interior life, he is defined solely by his method. In short, he is the perfect detective, the superhero of the Victorian era, out of which he blasted with his deer stalker hat and Inverness cape. Richard read the stories straight through, then read them again. His rigorous mind had found its match in Holmes and his science of deduction, which could wrest an astonishing solution from a single, seemingly unremarkable clue. All life is a great chain, the nature of which is known whenever we are shown a single link of it, Holmes explains in the first story, A Study in Scarlet, which establishes a narrative formula that subsequent tales nearly always follow. A new client arrives at Holmes's Baker Street consulting room. The detective stuns the visitor by deducing some element of his life by the mere observation of his demeanor or dress. In a case of identity, he divines that his client is a short-sighted typist by no more than the worn plush upon her sleeves and the dint of a pince-nez at either side of her nose. After the client presents the inexplicable facts of the case, the game is afoot, as Holmes likes to say. Amassing clues that invariably boggle Watson, the story's more earthbound narrator, Holmes ultimately arrives at a dazzling conclusion, one that, to him and him only, seems elementary. In The Red-Headed League, Holmes reveals to Watson how he surmised that an assistant pawnbroker was trying to rob a bank by tunneling underneath it. "I thought of the assistant's fondness for photography, and his trick of vanishing into the cellar," Holmes says, explaining that he then went to see the assistant. "I hardly looked at his face. His knees were what I wished to see. You must yourself have remarked how worn, wrinkled and stained they were. They spoke of those hours of burrowing. The only remaining point was what they were burrowing for. I walked round the corner, saw the City and Suburban Bank abutted on our friend's premises, and felt that I had solved my problem." Following the advice that Holmes often gave to Watson, Green practiced how to see what others merely observed. He memorized Holmes's rules, as if they were catechism, It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Never trust to general impressions, my boy, but concentrate yourself upon details. There is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Not long after Green turned 13, he carried an assortment of artifacts from local junk sales into the dimly lit attic of Polton Hall. Part of the attic was known as the Martyr's Chamber and was believed to be haunted, having once been tenanted by a lady, who was imprisoned there and persecuted to death for her religion, according to Hawthorne. Nevertheless, up in the attic, Green assembled his objects to create a strange tableau. There was a rack of pipes and a Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco. There was a stack of unpaid bills, which he stabbed into a mantle with a knife, so that they were pinned in place. There was a box of pills labeled poison, empty ammunition cartridges and tranquil bullet marks painted on the walls. I didn't think the attic would stand up to real bullets, he later remarked, a preserved snake, a brass microscope, and an invitation to the gasfitter's ball. Finally, outside the door of the room, Green hung a sign, Baker Street. Relying on the stray details sprinkled throughout Conan Doyle's stories, Green had pieced together a replica of Holmes and Watson's apartment, one so precise that it occasionally drew Holmes aficionados from other parts of England. One local reporter described the uncanny sensation of climbing the 17 stairs, the same number specified in the stories, as a tape recording played in the background with the sounds of Victorian London, the rumble of cab wheels, the clopping of horses' hooves on cobblestones. By then, Green had become the youngest person ever inducted into the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, where members sometimes dressed in period costumes in high-waisted trousers and top hats. Though Holmes had first appeared in print nearly a century earlier, he had spawned a literary cult unlike that of any other fictional character. Almost from his inception, readers latched onto him with a zeal that bordered on the mystical, as one Conan Doyle biographer has noted. When Holmes made his debut, in the 1887 Beaton's Christmas Annual, a magazine of somewhat lurid fiction, he was considered not just a character but a paragon of the Victorian faith in all things scientific. He entered public consciousness around the same time as the development of the modern police force, at a moment when medicine was finally threatening to eradicate common diseases and industrialization offered to curtail mass power. He was the proof that, indeed, the forces of reason could triumph over the forces of madness. By the time Green was born, however, the worship of scientific thinking had been shattered by other faiths, by Nazism and communism and fascism, which had often harnessed the power of technology to demonic ends. Yet, paradoxically, the more illogical the world seemed, the more intense the cult surrounding Holmes became. This symbol of a new creed had become a figure of nostalgia, a person in a fairy tale, as Green once put it. The character's popularity even surpassed the level of fame he had attained in Conan Doyle's day, as the stories were reenacted in some 260 movies, 25 television shows, a musical, a ballet, a burlesque, and 600 radio plays. Holmes inspired the creation of journals, memorabilia shops, walking tours, postage stamps, hotels, themed ocean cruises. Edgar W. Smith, a former vice president of General Motors and the first editor of the Baker Street Journal, which publishes scholarship on Conan Doyle's stories, wrote in a 1946 essay, "What is it that we love in Sherlock Holmes? We see him as the fine expression of our urge to trample evil and to set aright the wrongs with which the world is plagued. He is Galahad and Socrates, bringing high adventure to our dull existences and calm, judicial logic to our biased minds. He is the success of all our failures, the bold escape from our imprisonment. What has made this literary escape unlike any other, though, is that so many people conceive of Holmes as a real person. T.S. Eliot once observed, perhaps the greatest of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries is this, that when we talk of him we invariably fall into the fancy of his existence." Green himself wrote, "Sherlock Holmes is a real character, who lives beyond lifespan and who is constantly rejuvenated." At the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, Green was introduced to the great game, which Sherlockians had played for decades. It was built around the conceit that the story's true author was not Conan Doyle but Watson, who had faithfully recounted Holmes's exploits. Once, at a gathering of the elite Baker Street irregulars, which Green also joined, a guest referred to Conan Doyle as the creator of Holmes, prompting one outraged member to exclaim, "Holmes is a man. Holmes is a great man." If Green had to invoke Conan Doyle's name, he was told, he should refer to him as merely Watson's literary agent. The challenge of the game was that Conan Doyle had often written the 4 Holmes novels and 56 short stories, the sacred writings, as Sherlockians called them in haste, and they were plagued with inconsistencies that made them difficult to pass off as non-fiction. How, for instance, is it possible that in one story Watson is described as having been wounded in Afghanistan in the shoulder by a Jazile bullet, though in another story he complains that the wound was in his leg? The goal was thus to resolve these paradoxes, using the same airtight logic that Holmes exhibits. Similar textual inquiries had already given birth to a related field, known as Sherlockiana mock scholarship, in which fans tried to deduce everything from how many wives Watson has, 1 to 5, to which university Holmes attended, surely Cambridge or Oxford. As Green once conceded, quoting the founder of the Baker Street irregulars, "Never had so much been written by so many for so few." After Green graduated from Oxford, in 1975, he turned his attention to more serious scholarship. Of all the puzzles surrounding the sacred writings, the greatest one, Green realized, centered on the man whom the stories had long since eclipsed, Conan Doyle himself. Green set out to compile the first comprehensive bibliography, hunting down every piece of material that Conan Doyle wrote: pamphlets, plays, poems, obituaries, songs, unpublished manuscripts, letters to the editor. Carrying a plastic bag in place of a briefcase, Green unearthed documents that had long been hidden behind the veil of history. In the midst of this research, Green discovered that John Gibson was working on a similar project, and they agreed to collaborate. The resulting tome, published in 1983 by Oxford University Press, with a foreword by Graham Greene, is 712 pages long and contains notations on nearly every scrap of writing that Conan Doyle ever produced, down to the kind of paper in which a manuscript was bound: cloth, light blue diaper grain. When the bibliography was done, Gibson continued in his job as a government property assessor. Green, however, had inherited a sizable sum of money from his family, who had sold part of their estate, and he used the bibliography as a launching pad for a biography of Conan Doyle. Writing a biography is akin to the process of detection, and Green started to retrace every step of Conan Doyle's life, as if it were an elaborate crime scene. During the 1980s, Green followed Conan Doyle's movements from the moment he was born, on May 22, 1859, in a squalid part of Edinburgh. Green visited the neighborhood where Conan Doyle was raised, by a devout Christian mother and a dreamy father. He drew one of the first illustrations of Sherlock Holmes, a sketch of the detective discovering a corpse, which accompanied a paperback edition of A Study in Scarlet. Green also amassed an intricate paper record that showed his subject's intellectual evolution. He discovered, for instance, that after Conan Doyle studied medicine, at the University of Edinburgh, and fell under the influence of rationalist thinkers like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who undoubtedly inspired the surname of Conan Doyle's detective, he renounced Catholicism, vowing, "Never will I accept anything which cannot be proved to me." In the early 80s, Green published the first of a series of introductions to Penguin Classics editions of Conan Doyle's previously uncollected works, many of which he had helped to uncover. The essays, written in a clinical style, began garnering him attention outside the insular subculture of Sherlockians. One essay, running more than 100 pages, was a small biography of Conan Doyle unto itself. In another, Green cast further light on the short story The Case of the Man Who Was Wanted, which had been found in a chest more than a decade after Conan Doyle's death and was claimed by his widow and sons to be the last unpublished Holmes story. Some experts had wondered if the story was a fake, and even if Conan Doyle's 2 sons, in search of money to sustain their lavish lifestyles, had forged it. Yet Green conclusively showed that the story was neither by Conan Doyle nor a forgery. Instead, it was written by an architect named Arthur Whitaker, who had sent it to Conan Doyle in hopes of collaborating. Scholars described Green's essays variously as dazzling, unparalleled, and the ultimate compliment Holmesian. Still, Green was determined to dig deeper for his now highly anticipated biography. As the mystery writer Ian Pearce has observed, Conan Doyle's hero acts in nearly the same fashion as a Freudian analyst, piecing together his client's hidden narratives, which he alone can perceive. In a 1987 review of Conan Doyle's autobiography, Memories and Adventures, which was published in 1924, Green noted, "It is as if Conan Doyle, whose character suggested kindliness and trust, had a fear of intimacy. When he describes his life, he omits the inner man." To reveal this inner man, Green examined facts that Conan Doyle rarely, if ever, spoke of himself, most notably, that his father, an epileptic and an incorrigible alcoholic, was eventually confined to an insane asylum. Yet the more Green tried to plumb his subject, the more he became aware of the holes in his knowledge of Conan Doyle. He didn't want just to sketch Conan Doyle's story with a series of anecdotes, he wanted to know everything about him. In the draft of an early mystery story, The Surgeon of Gaster Fall, Conan Doyle writes of a son who has locked his raving father inside a cage, but this incident was excised from the published version. Had Conan Doyle been the one to commit his father to the asylum? Was Holmes's mania for logic a reaction to his father's genuine mania? And what did Conan Doyle mean when he wrote, in his deeply personal poem The Inner Room, that he has thoughts he dare not say? Green wanted to create an immaculate biography, one in which each fact led inexorably to the next. He wanted to be both Watson and Holmes to Conan Doyle, to be his narrator and his detective. Yet he knew the words of Holmes: data. 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 I can't make bricks without clay. And the only way to succeed, he realized, was to track down the lost archive. Murder, Owen Dudley Edwards, a highly regarded Conan Doyle scholar, said. I fear that is what the preponderance of the evidence points to. I had called him in Scotland, after Gibson informed me that Edwards was pursuing an informal investigation into Green's death. Edwards had worked with Green to stop the auction, which took place, in spite of the uproar, almost 2 months after Green's body was found. Edwards said of his friend, I think he knew too much about the archive. A few days later, I flew to Edinburgh, where Edwards promised to share with me his findings. We had arranged to meet at a hotel on the edge of the old city. It was on a hill studded with medieval castles and covered in a thin mist, not far from where Conan Doyle had studied medicine under Dr. Joseph Bell, one of the models for Sherlock Holmes. Once, during a class, Bell held up a glass vial. This, gentlemen, contains a most potent drug, he said. It is extremely bitter to the taste. To the class's astonishment, he touched the amber liquid, lifted a finger to his mouth, and licked it. He then declared, not one of you has developed his power of perception. While I placed my index finger in the awful brew, it was my middle finger eye which somehow found its way into my mouth. Edwards greeted me in the hotel lobby. He is a short, pear-shaped man with wild grey sideburns and an even wilder grey beard. A history professor at the University of Edinburgh, he wore a rumpled tweed coat over a V-neck sweater, and carried a knapsack on his shoulder. We sat down at the restaurant, and I waited as he rummaged through the books in his bag. Edwards, who has written numerous books, including The Quest for Sherlock Holmes, an acclaimed account of Conan Doyle's early life, began pulling out copies of Green's edited collections. Green, he said, was the world's greatest Conan Doyle expert. I have the authority to say it. Richard ultimately became the greatest of us all. That is a firm and definite statement of someone who knows. As he spoke, he tended to pull his chin in toward his chest, so that his beard fanned out. He told me that he had met Green in 1981, while researching his book on Conan Doyle. At the time, Green was still working on his bibliography with Gibson, Even so, he had shared all his data with Edwards. That was the kind of scholar he was, he said. To Edwards, Green's death was even more baffling than the crimes in a Holmes story. He picked up one of the Conan Doyle collections and read aloud from A Case of Identity, in the cool, ironical voice of Holmes. Life is infinitely stranger than anything which the mind of man could invent. We would not dare to conceive the things which are really mere commonplaces of existence. If we could fly out of that window hand in hand, hover over this great city, gently remove the roofs, and peep in at the queer things which are going on, the strange coincidences, the plannings, the cross-purposes, the wonderful chains of events, working through generations, and leading to the most outre results, it would make all fiction with its conventionalities and foreseen conclusion most stale and unprofitable. After Edwards closed the book, he explained that he had spoken frequently with Green about the Christie's sale. Our lives have been dominated by the fact that Conan Doyle had 5 children, 3 of whom became his literary heirs, Edwards said. The 2 boys were playboys. One of them, Dennis, was, I gather, utterly selfish. The other one, Adrian, was a repulsive crook. And then there was an absolutely wonderful daughter. Green, he said, had become so close to the daughter, Dame Jean, that he came to be known as the son she never had, even though in the past Conan Doyle's children had typically had fractious relationships with their father's biographers. In the early 1940s, for example, Adrian and Dennis had cooperated with Hesketh Pearson on Conan Doyle, His Life and Art, but when the book came out and portrayed Conan Doyle as the man in the street, a phrase Conan Doyle himself had used, Adrian rushed in to print his own biography, The True Conan Doyle, and Dennis allegedly challenged Pearson to a duel. Dame Jean had subsequently taken it upon herself to guard her father's legacy against scholars who might present him in too stark a light. Yet she confided in Green, who had tried to balance his veneration of his subject with a commitment to the truth. Edwards said that Dame Jean not only gave Green a glimpse of the treasured archive, she also asked for his help in transferring various papers to her solicitor's office. Richard told me that he had physically moved them, Edwards said. So his knowledge was really quite dangerous. He claimed that Green was the biggest figure standing in the way of the Christie's auction, since he had seen some of the papers and could testify that Dame Jean had intended to donate them to the British Library. Soon after the sale was announced, Edwards said, he and Green had learned that Charles Foley, Sir Arthur's great-nephew, and 2 of Foley's cousins were behind the sale. But neither he nor Green could understand how these distant heirs had legally obtained control of the archive. All we were clear about was that there was a scam and that, clearly, someone was robbing stuff that should go to the British Library, Edwards said. He added, this was not a hypothesis, it was quite certain in our own minds. Richard Lancelin Green in Meiringen, Switzerland, in 1991. Edwards also had little doubt that somebody had murdered his friend. He noted the circumstantial details, Green's mention of threats to his life, his reference to the American who was trying to bring him down. Some observers, he said, had speculated that Green's death might have been the result of autoerotic asphyxiation, but he told me that there were no signs that Green was engaged in sexual activity at the time. He added that garroting is typically a brutal method of execution, a method of murder which a skilled professional would use. What's more, Green had no known history of depression. Edwards pointed out that Green, on the day before he died, had made plans with another friend for a holiday in Italy the following week. Moreover, he said, if Green had killed himself there surely would have been a suicide note. It was inconceivable that a man who kept notes on everything would not have left one. There are other things, Edwards continued. He was garroted with a bootlace, yet he always wore slip-on shoes. And Edwards found meaning in seemingly insignificant details, the kind that Holmes might note particularly, the partially empty bottle of gin by his bed. To Edwards, this was a clear sign of the presence of a stranger, since Green, an enophile, had drunk wine at supper that evening, and would never have followed wine with gin. Whoever did this is still at large, Edwards said. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Please be careful. I don't want to see you garroted, like poor Richard." Before we parted, he told me one more thing. He knew who the American was. The American, who asked that I not use his name, lives in Washington, D.C. After I tracked him down, he agreed to meet me at Timberlake's pub near DuPont Circle. I found him sitting at the bar, sipping red wine. Though he was slumped over, he looked strikingly tall, with a hawkish nose and a thinning ring of gray hair. He appeared to be in his 50s and wore blue jeans and a button-down white shirt, with a fountain pen sticking out of the front pocket, like a professor. After pausing a moment to deduce who I was, he stood and led me to a table in the back of the room, which was filled with smoke and sounds from a jukebox. We ordered dinner, and he proceeded to tell me what Edwards had loosely sketched out, that he was a longtime member of the Baker Street Irregulars and had, for many years, helped to represent Conan Doyle's literary estate in America. It is his main job, though, that has given him a slightly menacing air, at least in the minds of Green's friends. He works for the Pentagon in a high-ranking post that deals with clandestine operations. One of Donald Rumsfeld's pals, as Edwards described him. The American said that after he received a PhD in international relations, in 1970, and became an expert in the Cold War and nuclear doctrine, he was drawn into the Sherlockian games and their pursuit of immaculate logic. "I've always kept the two worlds separate," he told me at one point. "I don't think a lot of people at the Pentagon would understand my fascination with a literary character." He met Green through the Sherlockian community, he said. As members of the Baker Street Irregulars, both had been given official titles from the home stories. The American was Roger Prescott of evil memory, after the American counterfeiter in The Adventure of the Three Garridabes. Green was known as the Three Gables, after the villa in The Adventure of the Three Gables, which is ransacked by burglars in search of a scandalous biographical manuscript. In the mid-1980s, the American said, he and Green had collaborated on several projects. As the editor of a collection of essays on Conan Doyle, he had asked Green, whom he considered then the single most knowledgeable living person on Conan Doyle, to write the crucial chapter on the author's 1924 memoir. "My relationship with Richard was always productive," he recalled. Then, in the early 1990s, he said, they had had a falling out, a result, he added, of a startling rupture in Green's relationship with Dame Jean. Richard had gotten very close to Dame Jean, and was getting all sorts of family photographs, having represented himself as a great admirer of Conan Doyle, he said. And then she saw something in print by him and suddenly realized that he had been representing his views very differently, and that was kind of the end of it. The American insisted that he couldn't remember what Green had written that upset her. But Edwards, and others in Holmesian circles, said that the reason nobody could recall a specific offense was that Green's essays had never been particularly inflammatory. According to R. Dixon Smith, a friend of Green's and a longtime Conan Doyle book dealer, the American played on Dame Jean's sensitivities about her father's reputation and seized upon some of Green's candid words, which had never upset her before, then twisted them like a screw. Edwards said of the American, "I think he did everything he possibly could to injure Richard. He drove a wedge between Richard and Dame Jean Conan Doyle." After Dame Jean cast Green out, Edwards and others noted, the American grew closer to her. Edwards told me that Green never got over the quarrel with Dame Jean. "He used to look at me like his heart was breaking," he said. When I pressed the American further about the incident, he said simply, "Because I was Jean's representative, I got caught in the middle of it." Soon after, he said, the good feeling and cooperation by Green toward me ended. At Sherlockian events, he said, they continued to see each other, but Green, always reserved, would often avoid him. Smith had told me that in Green's final months he often seemed preoccupied with the American. He kept wondering, what's he gonna do next? During the last week of his life, Green told several friends that the American was working to defeat his crusade against the auction, and he expressed fear that his rival might try to damage his scholarly reputation. On March 24, 2 days before he died, Green learned that the American was in London and was planning to attend a meeting that evening of the Sherlock Holmes Society. A friend said that Green called him and exclaimed, "I don't want to see him. I don't want to go." Green backed out of the meeting at the last minute. The friend said of the American, "I think he scared Richard." As I mentioned some of the allegations of Green's friends, the American unfolded his napkin and touched the corners of his mouth. He explained that during his visit to London he had offered counsel to Charles Foley, whom he now served as a literary representative, as he had for Dame Jean, and discussed the sale of the archive at Christie's. But the American emphasized that he had not seen or spoken to Green for more than a year. On the night that Green died, he revealed with some embarrassment, he was walking through London with his wife on a group tour of Jack the Ripper's crime scenes. He said that he had learned only recently that Green had become fixated on him before his death, and he noted that some Sherlockians blurred the line between fandom and fanaticism. It was because of the way people felt about the character, he said. Holmes was a sort of vampire-like creature, he said. He consumed some people. The waiter had served our meals, and the American paused to take a bite of steak and onion rings. He then explained that Conan Doyle had felt oppressed by his creation. Though the stories had made him the highest-paid author of his day, Conan Doyle wearied of constantly inventing problems and building up chains of inductive reason, as he once said bitterly. In the stories, Holmes himself seems overwhelmed by his task, going days without sleep, and, after solving a case, often shooting up cocaine, a 7% solution, in order to spell the subsequent drain and boredom. But, for Conan Doyle, there seemed to be no similar release, and he confided to one friend that Holmes is becoming such a burden to me that it makes my life unendurable. The very qualities that had made Holmes invincible, his character admits of no light or shade, as Conan Doyle put it, eventually made him intolerable. Moreover, Conan Doyle feared that the detective stories eclipsed what he called his more serious literary work. He had spent years researching several historical novels, which, he was convinced, would earn him a place in the pantheon of writers. In 1891, after he finished The White Company, which was set in the Middle Ages and based on tales of gallant, pious knights, he proclaimed, "Well, I'll never beat that." The book was popular in its day, but it was soon obscured by the shadow of Holmes, as were his other novels, with their comparatively stilted, lifeless prose. After Conan Doyle completed the domestic novel A Duet with an Occasional Chorus, in 1899, Andrew Lang, a well-known editor who had helped publish one of his previous books, summed up the sentiment of most readers: "It may be a vulgar taste, but we decidedly prefer the adventures of Dr. Watson with Sherlock Holmes." Conan Doyle was increasingly dismayed by the great paradox of his success. The more real Holmes became in the minds of readers, the less the author seemed to exist. Finally, Conan Doyle felt that he had no choice. As the American put it, he had to kill Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle knew that the death had to be spectacular. "A man like that mustn't die of a pinprick or influenza," he told a close friend. "His end must be violent and intensely dramatic." For months, he tried to imagine the perfect murder. Then, in December 1893, 6 years after he gave birth to Holmes, Conan Doyle published The Final Problem. The story breaks from the established formula: there is no puzzle to be solved, no dazzling display of deductive genius. And this time Holmes is the one pursued. He is being chased by Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime, who is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city of London. Moriarty is the first true counterpart to Holmes, a mathematician who is, as Holmes informs Watson, a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. Tall and ascetic-looking, he even physically resembles Holmes. What is most striking about the story, though, is that the two great logicians have descended into a logic. They are paranoid, and consumed only with each other. At one point, Moriarty tells Holmes, This is not danger. It is inevitable destruction. Finally, the two converge on a cliff overlooking Reichenbach Falls, in Switzerland. As Watson later deduces from evidence at the scene, Holmes and Moriarty struggled by the edge of the precipice before plunging to their deaths. After finishing the story, Conan Doyle wrote in his diary, with apparent delight, "Killed Holmes." As the American spoke of these details, he seemed stunned that Conan Doyle had gone through with such an extraordinary act. Still, he pointed out, Conan Doyle could not escape from his creation. In England, men reportedly wore black armbands in mourning. In America, clubs devoted to the cause Let's Keep Holmes Alive were formed. Though Conan Doyle insisted that Holmes's death was justifiable homicide, readers denounced him as a brute and demanded that he resuscitate their hero. After all, no one had actually seen him go off the cliff. As Green wrote in a 1983 essay, if ever a murderer was to be haunted by the man he had killed and to be forced to atone for his act, it was the creator, turned destroyer, of Sherlock Holmes. In 1901, under increasing pressure, Conan Doyle released The Hound of the Baskervilles, about an ancient family curse, but the events in the story antedated Holmes's death. Then, 2 years later, Conan Doyle succumbed completely and began writing new Holmes stories, explaining, less than convincingly, in The Adventure of the Empty House, that Holmes had never plunged to his death but merely arranged it to look that way so he could escape from Moriarty's gang. The American told me that even after Conan Doyle died, Holmes continued to loom over his descendants. Dame Jean thought that Sherlock Holmes was the family curse, he said. Like her father, he said, she had tried to draw attention to his other works but was constantly forced to tend to the detective's thousands of fans, many of whom sent letters addressed to Holmes, requesting his help in solving real crimes. In a 1935 essay entitled Sherlock Holmes the God, G.K. Chesterton observed of Sherlock Ians, "It is getting beyond a joke. The hobby is hardening into a delusion." Several actors who played Holmes were also haunted by him, the American said. In a 1956 autobiography, In and Out of Character, Basil Rathbone, who played the detective in more than a dozen films, complained that because of his portrayal of Holmes his renown for other parts, including Oscar-nominated ones, was sinking into oblivion. The public conflated him with his most famous character, which the studio and audience demanded he play again and again, until by the end he, too, lamented that he could not kill Mr. Holmes. Another actor, Jeremy Brett, had a breakdown while playing the detective and was eventually admitted to a psychiatric ward, where he was said to have cried out, "Damn you, Holmes." At one point, the American showed me a thick book, which he had brought to the pub. It was part of a multi-volume history that he was writing on the Baker Street irregulars and Sherlockian scholarship. He had started the project in 1988. "I thought if I searched pretty assiduously I'd find enough material to do a single 150-page volume," he said. "I've now done 5 volumes for more than 1,500 pages, and I've only gotten up to 1950. He added, "It's been a slippery slope into madness and obsession." As he spoke of his fascination with Holmes, he recalled one of the last times he had seen Green, 3 years earlier, at a symposium at the University of Minnesota. Green had given a lecture on The Hound of the Baskervilles. It was a multimedia presentation about the origins of the novel, and it was just dazzling, the American said. He repeated the word dazzling several times. "It's the only word to describe it," and as he sat up in his chair and his eyes brightened, I realized that I was talking not to Green's Moriarty but to his soulmate. Then, catching himself, he reminded me that he had a full-time job and a family. "The danger is if you have nothing else in your life but Sherlock Holmes," he said. In 1988, Richard Green made a pilgrimage to Reichenbach Falls to see where his childhood hero had nearly met his demise. Conan Doyle himself had visited the site in 1893, and Green wanted to repeat the author's journey. Standing at the edge of the falls, Green stared at the chasm below, where, as Watson noted after he called out, My only answer was my own voice reverberating in a rolling echo from the cliffs around me. By the mid-1990s, Green knew that he would not have access to the Conan Doyle archive until Dame Jean died, presuming that she bequeathed the papers to the British Library. In the meantime, he continued researching his biography, which, he concluded, would require no less than 3 volumes. The first would cover Conan Doyle's childhood, the second, the arc of his literary career, the third, his descent into a kind of madness. Relying on public documents, Green outlined this last stage, which began after Conan Doyle started using his powers of observation to solve real-world mysteries. In 1906, Conan Doyle took up the case of George Adelji, a half-Parsi Indian living near Birmingham, who faced 7 years of hard labor for allegedly mutilating his neighbor's cattle during the night. Conan Doyle suspected that Adelji had been tagged as a criminal merely because of his ethnicity, and he assumed the role of detective. Upon meeting his client, he noticed that the young man was holding a newspaper inches from his face. "Aren't you astigmatic?" Conan Doyle asked. "Yes," Adelji admitted. Conan Doyle called in an ophthalmologist, who confirmed that Adelji's malady was so severe that he was unable to see properly even with glasses. Conan Doyle then trekked to the scene of the crime, traversing a maze of railroad tracks and hedges. A strong and active man, in broad daylight, found it a hard matter to pass," he later wrote. Indeed, he contended, it would have been impossible for a nearly blind person to make the journey and then slaughter an animal in the pitch black of night. A tribunal soon concurred, and the New York Times declared, "Conan Doyle solves a new Dreyfus case." Conan Doyle even helped in solving a case of a serial killer, after he spotted newspaper accounts in which 2 women had died in the same bizarre manner. The victims were recent brides, who had accidentally drowned in their bathtubs. Conan Doyle informed Scotland Yard of his theory, telling the inspector, in an echo of Holmes, "No time is to be lost." The killer, dubbed the Bluebeard of the Bath, was subsequently caught and convicted in a sensational trial. Around 1914, Conan Doyle tried to apply his rational powers to the most important matter of his day, the logic of launching the First World War. He was convinced that the war was not simply about entangling alliances and a dead archduke, it was a sensible way to restore the codes of honor and moral purpose that he had celebrated in his historical novels. That year, he unleashed a spate of propaganda, declaring, "Fear not, for our sword will not be broken, nor shall it ever drop from our hands." In the Holmes story His Last Bow, which is set in 1914, the detective tells Watson that after the storm has cleared, a cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine. Though Conan Doyle was too old to fight, many of his relatives heeded his call to arms, including his son Kingsley. The glorious battle Conan Doyle envisioned, however, became a cataclysm. The products of scientific reason, machines and engineering and electronics, were transformed into agents of destruction. Conan Doyle visited the battlefield by the Somme, where tens of thousands of British soldiers died, and where he later reported seeing a soldier drenched crimson from head to foot, with 2 great glazed eyes looking upwards through a mask of blood. In 1918, a chastened Conan Doyle realized that the conflict was evidently preventable. By that time, 10 million people had perished, including Kingsley, who died from battle wounds and influenza. After the war, Conan Doyle wrote a handful of Holmes stories, yet the field of detective fiction was changing. The all-knowing detective gradually gave way to the hard-boiled Dick, who acted more on instinct and gin than on reason. In The Simple Art of Murder, Raymond Chandler, while admiring Conan Doyle, dismissed the tradition of the grim logician and his exhausting concatenation of insignificant clues, which now seemed like an absurdity. Meanwhile, in his own life, Conan Doyle seemed to abandon reason altogether. As one of Green's colleagues in the Baker Street Irregulars, Daniel Stosshauer, relates in a 1999 book, Teller of Tales, The Life of Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Holmes began to believe in ghosts. He attended seances and received messages from the dead through the power of automatic writing, a method akin to that of the Ouija board. During one session, Conan Doyle, who had once considered the belief in life after death as a delusion, claimed that his dead younger brother said, "It is so grand to be in touch like this." One day, Conan Doyle heard a voice in the seance room. As he later described the scene in a letter to a friend, "I said, 'Is that you, boy?' He said in a very intense whisper and a tone all his own, 'Father,' and then after a pause, 'Forgive me.' I said, 'There was never anything to forgive. You were the best son a man ever had.' A strong hand descended on my head which was slowly pressed forward, and I felt a kiss just above my brow. 'Are you happy?' I cried. There was a pause and then very gently, 'I am so happy.'" The creator of Sherlock Holmes had become the St. Paul of psychics. Conan Doyle claimed to see not only dead family members but fairies as well. He championed photographs taken in 1917 by two girls that purported to show such phantasmal creatures, even though, as one of the girls later admitted, "I could see the hatpins holding up the figures. I've always marveled that anybody ever took it seriously." Conan Doyle, however, was convinced, and even published a book called The Coming of Fairies. He opened the psychic bookshop in London and told friends that he had received messages that the world was coming to an end. "I suppose I am Sherlock Holmes, if anybody is, and I say that the case for spiritualism is absolutely proved," he declared. In 1918, a headline in the Sunday Express asked, "Is Conan Doyle mad?" For the first time, Green struggled to rationalize his subject's life. In one essay, Green wrote, "It is hard to understand how a man who had stood for sound common sense and healthy attitudes could sit in darkened rooms watching for ectoplasm." Green reacted at times as if his hero had betrayed him. In one passage, he wrote angrily, Conan Doyle was deluding himself. One thing Richard couldn't stand was Conan Doyle's being involved with spiritualism, Edwards said. He thought it crazy. His friend Dixon Smith told me, it was all Conan Doyle. He pursued him with all his mind and body. Green's house became filled with more and more objects from Conan Doyle's life, long-forgotten propaganda leaflets and speeches on spiritualism, an arcane study of the Boer War, previously unknown essays on photography. I remember once, I discovered a copy of a duet with an occasional chorus, Gibson said. It had a great red cover on it. I showed it to Richard and he got really excited. He said, "God, this must have been the salesman's copy." When Green found one of the few surviving copies of the 1887 Beaton's Christmas Annual, with a study in scarlet, which was worth as much as $130,000, he sent a card to a friend with two words on it, "At last." Green also wanted to hold things that Conan Doyle himself had held, letter openers and pens and spectacles. He would collect all day and all night, and I mean night, his brother, Sirard, told me. Green covered many of his walls with Conan Doyle's family photographs. He even had a piece of wallpaper from one of Conan Doyle's homes. Obsession is by no means too strong a word to describe what Richard had, his friend Nicholas Yotechin, the editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, said. It's self-perpetuating and I don't know how to stop, Green confessed to an antiques magazine in 1999. By 2000, his house resembled the attic at Polton Hall, only now he seemed to be living in a museum dedicated to Conan Doyle rather than to Holmes. I have around 40,000 books, Green told the magazine. Then, of course, there are the photographs, the pictures, the papers, and all the other ephemera. I know it sounds a lot, but, you see, the more you have, the more you feel you need. And what he longed for most remained out of reach, the archive. After Dame Jean died, in 1997, and no papers materialized at the British Library, he became increasingly frustrated. Where he had once judiciously built his conjectures about Conan Doyle's life, he now seemed reckless. In 2002, to the shock of Doyleans around the world, Green wrote a paper claiming that he had proved that Conan Doyle had had a tryst with Jean Leckie, his delicately beautiful second wife, before his first wife, Louisa, died of tuberculosis, in 1906. Though it was well known that Conan Doyle had formed a bond with Lecky during his wife's long illness, he had always insisted, "I fight the devil and I win." And, to maintain an air of Victorian rectitude, he often brought along chaperones when he and Lecky were together. Green based his allegation on the 1901 census, which reported that on the day the survey was taken Conan Doyle was staying at the Ashdown Forest Hotel, in East Sussex. So, too, was Lecky. Conan Doyle could not have chosen a worse weekend on which to have a private tryst, Green wrote. Yet Green failed to note one crucial fact also contained in the census report: Conan Doyle's mother was staying in the hotel with him, apparently as a chaperone. Later, Green was forced to recant, in a letter to the Sherlock Holmes Journal, saying, "I was guilty of the capital mistake of theorizing without data." Still, he continued to lash out at Conan Doyle, as Conan Doyle once had at Sherlock Holmes. Edwards recalled that, in one conversation, Green decried Conan Doyle as unoriginal and a plagiarist. He confessed to another friend, "I've wasted my whole life on a second-rate writer." "I think he was frustrated because the family wasn't coming to any agreement," Smith said. "The archive wasn't made available, and he got angry not at the heirs but at Conan Doyle." Last March, when Green hurried to Christie's after the auction of the papers was announced, he discovered that the archive was as rich and as abundant as he'd imagined. Among the thousands of items were fragments of the first tale that Conan Doyle wrote, at the age of 6, illustrated logs from when Conan Doyle was a surgeon on a Scottish whaling ship, in the 1880s, letters from Conan Doyle's father, whose drawings in the asylum resembled the fairies that his son later seized upon as real, a brown envelope with a cross and the name of his dead son inscribed upon it, the manuscript of Conan Doyle's first novel, which was never published, a missive from Conan Doyle to his brother, which seemed to confirm that Green's hunch had been right, and that Conan Doyle had in fact begun an affair with Lecky. Jane Flower, who helped to organize the papers for Christie's, told reporters, "The whereabouts of this material was previously unknown, and it is for this reason that no modern-day biography of the author exists." Meanwhile, back at his home, Green tried to piece together why the archive was about to slip into private hands once more. According to Green's family, he typed notes in his computer, re-examining the trail of evidence, which he thought proved that the papers belonged to the British Library. He worked late into the night, frequently going without sleep. None of it, however, seemed to add up. At one point, he typed in bold letters, "Stick to the facts." After another sleepless night, he told his sister that the world seemed Kafkaesque. Several hours before Green died, he called his friend Yotechin at home. Green had asked him to find a tape of an old BBC radio interview, which, Green recalled, quoted one of Conan Doyle's heirs saying that the archive should be given to the British Library. Yotechin said that he had found the tape, but there was no such statement on the recording. Green became apoplectic, and accused his friend of conspiring against him, as if he were another Moriarty. Finally, Yotechin said, "Richard, you've lost it?" One afternoon while I was at my hotel in London, the phone rang. "I need to see you again," John Gibson said. "I'll take the next train in." Before he hung up, he added, "I have a theory." I met him in my hotel room. He was carrying several scraps of paper, on which he had taken notes. He sat down by the window, his slender figure silhouetted in the fading light, and announced, "I think it was suicide." He had sifted through the data, including details that I had shared with him from my own investigation. There was mounting evidence, he said, that his rationalist friend was betraying signs of irrationality in the last week of his life. There was the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry at Green's home. And there was the fact, perhaps most critically, of the wooden spoon by Green's hand. He had to have used it to tighten the cord like a tourniquet, Gibson said. If someone else had garroted him, why would he need the spoon? The killer could simply use his hands. He continued, I think things in his life had not turned out the way he wanted. This Christie's sale simply brought everything to a head. He glanced nervously at his notes, which he strained to see without his magnifying glass. That's not all, he said. I think he wanted it to look like murder. He waited to assess my reaction, then went on, that's why he didn't leave a note. That's why he took his voice off the answering machine. That's why he sent that message to his sister with the 3 phone numbers on it. That's why he spoke of the American who was after him. He must have been planning it for days, laying the foundation, giving us false clues. I knew that, in detective fiction, the reverse scenario generally turns out to be true. A suicide is found to have been murder. As Holmes declares in The Resident Patient, this is no suicide. It is a very deeply planned and cold-blooded murder. There is, however, one notable exception. It is, eerily enough, in one of the last Holmes mysteries, The Problem of Thorbridge, a story that Green once cited in an essay. A wife is found lying dead on a bridge, shot in the head at point-blank range. All the evidence points to one suspect, the governess, with whom the husband had been flirting. Yet Holmes shows that the wife had not been killed by anyone, rather, enraged by jealousy over her husband's illicit overtures to the governess, she had killed herself and framed the woman whom she blamed for her misery. Of all Conan Doyle's stories, it digs deepest into the human psyche and its criminal motivations. As the governess tells Holmes, when I reached the bridge she was waiting for me. Never did I realize till that moment how this poor creature hated me. She was like a mad woman indeed. I think she was a mad woman, subtly mad with the deep power of deception which insane people may have. I wondered if Green could have been so enraged with the loss of the archive that he might have done something similar, and even tried to frame the American, whom he blamed for ruining his relationship with Dame Jean and for the sale of the archive. I wondered if he could have tried, in one last desperate attempt, to create order out of the chaos around him. I wondered if this theory, however improbable, was in fact the least impossible. I shared with Gibson some other clues I had uncovered, the call that Green had made to the reporter days before his death, saying that something might happen to him, a reference in a Holmes story to one of Moriarty's main henchmen as a garroter by trade, and a statement to the coroner by Green's sister, who said that the note with the 3 phone numbers had reminded her of the beginning of a thriller. After a while, Gibson looked up at me, his face ghastly white. "Don't you see?" he exclaimed. "He staged the whole thing. He created the perfect mystery. Before I went back to America, I went to see Green's sister, Priscilla West. She lives near Oxford, in a 3-story, 18th-century brick house with a walled garden. She had long, wavy brown hair, an attractive round face, and small oval glasses. She invited me inside with a reticent voice, saying, 'Are you a drawing room person or a kitchen person?' I shrugged uncertainly, and she led me into the drawing room, which had antique furniture and her father's children's books on the shelves. As we sat down, I explained to her that I had been struggling to write her brother's story. The American had told me, there is no such thing as a definitive biography, and Green seemed particularly resistant to explication. Richard compartmentalized his life, his sister said. There are a lot of things we've only found out since he died. At the inquest, his family, and most of his friends, had been startled when Lawrence Keene, who was nearly half Green's age, announced that he had been Richard's lover years ago. No one in the family knew that Green was gay, his sister explained. It wasn't something he ever talked about. As West recalled other surprising fragments of Green's biography, Travels to Tibet, a brief attempt at writing a novel, I tried to picture him as best I could with his glasses, his plastic bag in hand, and his wry smile. West had seen her brother's body lying on the bed, and several times she told me, "I just wish," before falling silent. She handed me copies of the eulogies that Green's friends had delivered at the memorial service, which was held on May 22, the day Conan Doyle was born. On the back of the program from the service were several quotes from Sherlock Holmes stories. I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. He appears to have a passion for definite and exact knowledge. His career has been an extraordinary one. After a while, she got up to pour herself a cup of tea. When she sat down again, she said that her brother had willed his collection to a library in Portsmouth, near where Conan Doyle wrote the first 2 Holmes stories, so that other scholars could have access to it. The collection was so large that it had taken 2 weeks, and required 12 truckloads, to cart it all away. It was estimated to be worth several $1 million far more, in all likelihood, than the treasured archive. He really did not like the idea of scholarship being put second to greed, West said. He lived and died by this. She then told me something about the archive which had only recently come to light, and which her brother had never learned. Dame Jean Conan Doyle, while dying of cancer, had made a last-minute deed of apportionment, splitting the archive between herself and the 3 heirs of her former sister-in-law, and Conan Doyle. What was being auctioned off, therefore, belonged to the 3 heirs, and not to Dame Jean, and, though some people still questioned the morality of the sale, the British Library had reached the conclusion that it was legal. Green also could not know that after the auction, on May 19, the most important papers ended up at the British Library. Dame Jean had not allotted those documents to the other heirs, and had willed many of them to the library. At the same time, the library had purchased much of the remaining material at the auction. As Gibson later told me, the tragedy is that Richard could have still written his biography. He would have had everything he needed. 2 questions, however, remained unclear. How, I asked West, did an American voice wind up on her brother's answering machine? I'm afraid it's not that complicated, she said. The machine, she continued, was made in the United States and had a built-in recorded message. When her brother took off his personal message, a pre-recorded American voice appeared. I then asked about the phone numbers in the note. She shook her head in dismay. They added up to nothing, she said. They were merely those of 2 reporters her brother had spoken to, and the number of someone at Christie's. Finally, I asked what she thought had happened to her brother. At one point, Sirard Lancelin Green had told the London Observer that he thought murder was entirely possible, and, for all my attempts to build a case that transcended doubt, there were still questions. Hadn't the police told the coroner that an intruder could have locked Green's apartment door while slipping out, thus giving the illusion that his victim had died alone? Wasn't it possible that Green had known the murderer and simply let him in? And how could someone, even in a fit of madness, garrote himself with merely a shoelace and the help of a spoon? His sister glanced away, as if trying one last time to arrange all the pieces. Then she said, I don't think we'll ever know for sure what really happened. Unlike in detective stories, we have to live without answers. Diamond sued. Published in the print edition of the December 13, 2004, issue. The end.